Part 28. The Rebirth of Space, the Lucky Girl from a Farm Family. Author, He Would Fire Every. Chapter 271. Chapter 271 Unavoidable. Panjunian bowed to King Chi, stood up and said to everyone, "Your Majesty ordered 2 plays today. The first play is Jade Flute and the second is Meng Sheng. There are brief introductions to these 2 plays in the booklet on the table. You can get to know them first and start them when you are young." Gu Huayu picked up the brochure on the table and read it. The story of the Jade Flute tells the story of a prince who encounters an accident while traveling. When his life is on the line, he meets a kind-hearted peasant girl. The peasant girl tries her best to save the prince. The two fall in love over time, but because of the disparity in status was suppressed by all parties, a love story in which the two finally got married after going through hardships. The records of Meng Sheng tells the touching story of a man named Mencius who left his wife, children, and mother to fight in order to resist the invasion of foreign enemies and served his country with loyalty. As soon as Gu Huayu closed the book, the sound of musical instruments sounded on the stage, and the minor actors appeared one after another. Gu Huayu turned her eyes to the stage and started watching the play seriously. King Chi turned his head to look at Gu Huayu several times, wanting to talk to her, but seeing how attentive she was, he never said anything to disturb her. Gu Huayu felt a little dazed watching the performance of the people on the stage. In modern times, her father is a fan, and under his influence, she has some understanding of opera. From the moves of the people on the stage, it can be seen that Pan Yuan's reputation today is not false, but the result of years of hard work, which is very rare. At the end of a play, there is a quarter of an hour's break. King Chi turned around and was about to talk to Gu Huayu, but Gu Huayu was one step ahead of him and leaned towards him and said, "My lord, I have to go to the palace. Please forgive me." Based on his intuition, King Chi felt that Gu Huayu was avoiding him intentionally, but since the other party wanted to go to the palace, he could not say anything and could only nod in agreement. Seeing Gu Huayu stand up, Shi Yamei stood up and walked quickly towards Gu Huayu. "Xiao, I have to go to the palace, how about you?" Gu Huayu nodded, "Me too, together." Seeing the two of them walking out, Zhang Xinran raised her voice and said, "Princess, Miss Shi-san, wait for me." Gu Huayu and Shi Yamei stopped to wait for Zhang Xinran. While waiting for others, Shi Yamei whispered, "Ran Ran has a good personality, is independent, and is a well-measured person. He is worth dating." Gu Huayu nodded, "I can see it." Shi Yamei then asked, "Did King Chi give you any trouble?" Gu Huayu shook her head, "No, everyone is focused on watching the show and there is no time to talk." Shi Yamei felt relieved and said, "That's good. It's awkward for 2 people who don't know each other to sit together and watch a show. Also, I feel that King Chi's drunkard's intention is not drinking. The play is over in a while, let's quickly find a way to leave. It would be better for us to avoid provoking less people like King Chi from the heavenly family." Gu Huayu nodded. If possible, she would like to leave now, immediately. Shi Yamei saw Zhang Xinran coming and said, "Let's go." The 3 of them left the theater, and Zhang Xinran asked with concern, "Princess, did the King of Qi make things difficult for you?" Gu Huayu smiled, shook her head and said, "No." Zhang Xinran breathed a sigh of relief, and then reminded, "Li Yi has annoyed you today, you have to be careful about her in the future." Gu Huayu turned to look at Zhang Xinran and asked, "Afraid of me? Why?" Zhang Xinran looked back and saw that no one was following her, so she whispered, "Li Yi likes King Chi. Everyone in the capital circle knows it, and they already know what they should know. Li Yi is the niece of the imperial concubine, and she grew up under her watch. Li Yi is now 16 and has not yet discussed marriage, but she wants to marry into the Prince of Qi's palace and become the Princess of Qi." Gu Huayu didn't want to get involved in these messy relationships at all. He looked up at the sky and sighed, it's really unlucky for her mother. Does this mean that I am sitting at home and the disaster comes from the sky? Shiyame looked at her sympathetically and nodded, forget it. Seeing Gu Huayu's depressed look, Zhang Xinran comforted her, just be careful, don't worry too much. Gu Huayu sighed and said, the play is about to begin, let's go back. Zhang Xinran nodded, come back, I've been out for a long time. Gu Huayu walked in front and entered the door. She saw Li Yiyi sitting in her seat, lowering her head and listening to King Qi's words. She didn't know what King Qi said, which made Li Yiyi cover her mouth and laugh. Gu Huayu stopped and Shi Yame asked, Xiao, why don't you leave? Gu Huayu pointed to the seat next to her and said, I'll sit here. You stay with me. The women's courtroom should go out from the right side of the theater. They are some distance away from King Qi and Li Yiyi. Shi Yame glanced at King Qi, nodded and said, okay, I'll sit here with you. Zhang Xinran said, then I will sit at the table behind you. King Qi felt that Gu Huayu had not returned for a long time, so he raised his head and looked to the right. He saw Gu Huayu and Shi Yame sitting at the entrance on the right. His eyes darkened and he said to Li Yi, Yi, go back to your seat. Li Yi has been clinging to King Qi like a follower since she was a child, and she knows King Qi's emotions very well. She could almost judge King Qi's moods and sorrows from some of his very subtle movements. Based on Li Yi's experience, King Qi's words contained a hint of forbearance, indicating that King Qi was angry. Li Yi looked at King Qi, followed his gaze and turned to look at Gu Huayu sitting on the right. She felt a strong jealousy in her heart, which made her unwilling and unhappy. But she didn't dare to show it in front of King Qi. She was afraid that she would offend King Qi, so she bowed obediently and said, okay, I'll sit over right now. After Li Yi stood up and left, King Qi also stood up and walked to the right. Zhang Xinran saw King Qi approaching and reminded Gu Huayu and Shi Yame, who were talking quietly together, the prince is here. Shi Yame looked up and saw that King Qi was only 6 or 7 steps away from them. Shi Yame asked nervously, Xiao, what should I do? Gu Huayu didn't expect that King Qi would come over directly, and her mind was confused for a while. She looked at King Qi blankly and didn't know what to do. Zhang Ying has been paying attention to Gu Huayu's whereabouts. When Gu Huayu returned to the room and sat down on the right side, Zhang Ying became excited. Based on his understanding of King Qi would not let Gu Huayu sit aside. In Zhang Ying's heart, King Qi has always been a domineering person. The behavior of King Qi Jinner almost announced to the people present that Gu Huayu had caught his eye. At this moment, Gu Huayu left King Qi and sat aside alone. King Qi would definitely express something. Sure enough, after a while, Zhang Ying saw King Qi walking towards Gu Huayu. The show was about to begin. Zhang Ying was so excited that she raised her hand and knocked Li Tao, who was chatting with Lin Wangshu, and pursed her lips at him. Li Tao looked in the direction indicated by Zhang Ying and saw King Qi walking to the table where Shi Yame and Gu Huayu were sitting, with an expression as if he was calling for an apology. Li Tao couldn't help but feel nervous. He was talking to Lin Wangshu just now and didn't notice when Gu Huayu came back and how he sat on the right side. Lin Wangshu looked at the people at the door with confusion and asked, what's going on? Zhang Ying shook her head and pretended to be stupid and said, I don't know. Li Tao stood up and went to the door, but Li Cheng grabbed him. Li Tao looked at Li Cheng and whispered, brother. Li Cheng shook his head at him and lowered his voice, if you go there, you will only cause trouble to the princess. Li Tao said worriedly, what should we do? Your Majesty. Li Cheng said softly, in public, the prince will not do anything to the princess and sit still. After being reminded by Li Cheng, Li Tao's high-spirited heart relaxed. He is care-inducing, and Xiao is not a girl from an ordinary family. She is Princess Yan Ran, who was personally granted the title by the emperor. Her father was once a close minister of the emperor, and she also has a fish charm given by the emperor. Li Tao thought of this, and his heart relaxed again. King Qi stood in front of Gu Huayu and asked, "Why is Yan Ran sitting here?" Gu Huayu had calmed down, stood up, and said, "It's nothing." Seeing that the prince and Miss Li San had something to say, my daughter didn't want to come forward to ask for mercy, so she and Yamei sat down here. Gu Huayu's generous answer surprised King Qi. He was very satisfied with her explanation. From King Qi's point of view, Gu Huayu sat here because she was jealous of him and Yi Yi. He has seen many scenes of jealous women. The fact that Gu Huayu can be jealous shows that she cares about him. Thinking of this, King Qi's previous displeasure dissipated. She subconsciously explained, "I would like to have a few words with Yi Yi, there is nothing to disturb me." Gu Huayu despised Wang Qiao in her heart, and said with a smile that could not reach her eyes, "The play is about to begin, where do you plan to start from?" As soon as Gu Huayu finished speaking, music started playing on the stage. King Qi turned to Shi Yamei and said, "Miss Shi-san, please move. I and Yan Ran are sitting here." Shi Yamei was so shocked by King Qi's straightforward request that she didn't know how to respond. She looked at King Qi stupidly with her eyes. Seeing Shi Yamei looking at him like a stupid goose, King Qi frowned slightly and said, "What?" Miss Shi-san didn't understand. Zhang Xinran reacted first and pulled Shi Yamei over. "Yamei, sit with me." Shi Yamei was brought back to consciousness by Zhang Xinran and said, Okay, Ran, and I will sit together." Gu Huayu looked at King Qi speechlessly. She wanted to swear. "Is this guy the extremely arrogant Luzikin said? Damn it, this is not conceited, this is simply arrogant." "Yan Ran, sit down," King Qi reminded Gu Huayu when he saw her standing in a daze. Gu Huayu looked at King Qi, bowed slightly, and then sat down. Shakes of people were walking around on the stage. Gu Huayu stared at the stage closely, but didn't see anything. She was thinking about finding a way to leave later. King Qi looked sideways and saw Gu Huayu staring at the stage, and asked, "Yan Ran likes to go to the theater." Gu Huayu was immersed in her own thoughts and didn't hear what King Qi said, so she naturally couldn't answer. When King Qi saw that she didn't respond, he just thought that she was fascinated by the play, so he didn't say anything more. Yamei, who was sitting in the back row, focused all her attention on King Qi and Gu Huayu. Seeing King Qi asking Gu Huayu looked at the stage motionlessly, not even looking at King Qi. Shi Yamei was afraid that Gu Huayu would offend King Qi, so she couldn't help but worry about Gu Huayu. It wasn't until King Qi turned his head to the stage to watch the play seriously that Shi Yamei felt relieved. Bang! Gu Huayu was startled by the sound on the stage. King Qi looked over and asked, "What's wrong?" Gu Huayu bowed embarrassedly and said, "I'm sorry, I'm so embarrassed." They acted so well, so realistically. King Qi really thought that Gu Huayu was moved by the role, nodded, and explained with a smile, "Mr. Pan has very high requirements for his disciples, and he wants them to be selfless when acting. So, the disciples are fully immersed in the performance and integrate themselves into the characters. This is also the reason why Pan Yuan's play is wonderful." Gu Huayu said with admiration, "Mr. Pan is amazing. Let's continue reading." After speaking, Gu Huayu turned her eyes to the stage. King Qi said, "If Yan Ran likes it, you can come often in the future." Gu Huayu turned to look at King Qi, shook her head and said, "Thank you, Your Majesty, no need. Your Majesty has already asked Mr. Pan to make an exception for us once, how dare you ask Mr. Pan to make an exception again?" King Qi smiled and said, "Who said that Mr. Pan needs to make an exception to come to Pan Yuan? For anything, to achieve the goal, there is not only one way, but at least 3 or more methods." After hearing what King Qi said, Gu Huayu immediately became alert. The guy in front of her was not the son of a stupid landlord with lots of money, but the real eldest son of the emperor. Don't speak casually in front of him, lest he takes advantage of you. Gu Huayu leaned forward and said, "Thank you, Your Majesty, but don't bother me. Only rare things that are sought for will make people cherish them more. If you can have them casually, you won't take them seriously." King Chi looked at Gu Huayu with admiration and said, "It's very rare for you to have such an understanding at such a young age. If you want to come to the theater in the future, tell me that I will accompany you." Gu Huayu leaned forward again, "Thank you, Your Majesty." Gu Huayu straightened up and saw Shi Yamei and Zhang Xinran standing up to applaud. She turned to look at the stage, where everyone was bowing and thanking them. After the two plays were performed, Pan Junian came out from the backstage and went straight to the King of Qi. The King of Qi folded his folding fan, raised his hands and bowed to Pan Junian, saying, "Thank you very much for today, sir." Pan Junian hurriedly stepped aside, avoiding King Qi's courtesy, and bowed to King Qi and said, "Your Majesty, you can't do it. I'm going to kill you. Your Majesty, will you stay for a cup of tea?" King Qi shook his head and said, "Forget it for now, I will come to bother you another day." Pan Junian said, "Your Majesty's business is important, so I won't try to keep you here. I'll send you out instead." The King of Qi thanked him politely, but Pan Junian insisted on sending the gift to the King of Qi. King Qi no longer refused and allowed him to everyone to the gate of Peinyuan. Along the way, Li Chang, Lu Yu, and others had to say some words of appreciation and thanks to Pan Junian. Gu Huayu, Shi Yamei, and Zhang Xinran fell behind the team. Shi Yamei asked, "Xiao, let's get in the car and leave as soon as we get to the door." Gu Huayu turned to look at Shi Yamei and asked, "What else? Do you still want to stay?" Zhang Xinran took over the message, "My brother made a reservation at Fan Tower and invited everyone to have lunch. Isn't it good that you two just left like this?" Shi Yamei looked at Gu Huayu worriedly, "Xiao, what do you think?" Gu Huayu didn't want to stay in the same place with King Qi anymore. She looked at Zhang Xinran and said, "Brother, please help me to say a few good words. Let's apologize to brother later. We won't go to the appointment today. Please invite Miss Zhang, forgive me." End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 272. Chapter 272. It doesn't matter much. Zhang Xinran responded, "Okay, feel free to go. Let's meet again another day." Zhang Xinran responded readily. Zhang Ying followed King Qi and walked to the gate of Panyuan. She turned around and saw Zhang Xinran, Shi Yamei, and Gu Huayu far behind. The three of them got together and didn't know what to say, so they raised their voices and urged, Ran, you guys, what are you talking about? Come here quickly, everyone is waiting for you." "Here we come. Let's go over," Zhang Xinran shouted back, then said to Gu Huayu and Shi Yamei. The three of them hurried to the gate. Seeing Gu Huayu and Shi Yamei approaching, Zhang Ying leaned towards them and said, Princess, Miss Shi-san, I have made a reservation at the fan tower next door. You two will show me your favor, and we will have lunch together." Before Shi Yamei and Gu Huayu could reply, Zhang Xinran said first, "Brother, I have already invited the princess and Yamei. They have other things to do and cannot have lunch with us." When King Qi heard that Gu Huayu was leaving, he stopped shaking the folding fan, stopped talking to Pan Junian, and turned around. Lu Yu looked up at Shi Yamei and asked, "So busy? You don't even have time for lunch?" Zhang Ying took over the words, "Yes, no matter how busy you are, you still need to eat, right? If you have anything to do, just go over after eating." King Qi looked at Gu Huayu and asked, "What's the matter with you?" "What's the matter?" There was a bit of dissatisfaction in his words, and there was also a bit of superior questioning. Facing King Qi's questioning, Gu Huayu felt a surge of disgust from the bottom of her heart. She had nothing to do with him, no matter what. It's so funny, who is he to her? She has to report to him. They have only met each other twice and are a little more familiar than strangers. Just when Gu Huayu was angry, a voice came over. Xiao. Gu Huayu felt happy, turned around and looked over, and saw Lu Zikan, dressed in white, standing by the carriage with his hands folded, looking at her with a smile like a spring breeze. In an instant, Gu Huayu's bad mood dissipated. Brother Zikan, Gu Huayu ran towards Lu Zikan, her joyful pace could not hide her joy, and her whole body was full of vitality. The changes before and after shocked everyone present. Lu Zikan saw Gu Huayu running towards him, his eyes staring at her closely, the smile on his face deepened, and he reminded with concern, "Slow down, be careful of falling." King Chi's eyes were stung by the sight in front of him, his face was as dark as ink, and his hands that kept tightening almost broke the folding fan in his hand. The rest of the people were so shocked that their eyes widened and they looked at Lu Zikan and Gu Huayu blankly, unable to recover for a while. Gu Huayu rushed to Lu Zikan and looked at Lu Zikan with a smile. "When did Brother Zikan arrive? Have you been waiting for a long time?" Lu Zikan lowered his head and looked at Gu Huayu, his eyes full of endearment, and replied softly, "Not long, only half an hour." The tenderness in Lu Zikan's eyes made King Chi want to hit him. King Chi took a step forward and shouted with a stern face, "Lulu." Hearing King Chi's call, Lu Zikan looked up, suppressed the smile on his face, bowed his hands to King Chi in greeting, and said coldly, "Hello, King Chi." Lu Yu knew that King Chi and Lu Zikan had never dealt with each other, so he made peace with Lu Zikan and said, "When did King Jian arrive? Why didn't you let someone in to report it?" Lu Zikan bowed and returned the courtesy, "It's good to be sensitive. I'll come down here to pick up Xiao Yu. I don't want to disturb you. Just wait outside." After speaking, Lu Zikan bowed his hands to everyone present again. Zhang Ying said, "Just in time, I have made a reservation at Fanlu, and Qin Jian will have 2 drinks together." Lu Zikan leaned forward and said, "Thank you for the invitation, Men Yang. I have something to do today, so I won't go to the appointment. I'll do something for you another day, and I'll apologize to you all." After finishing speaking, Lu Zikan looked at Gu Huayu and asked, "Xiao, can you leave? Hurry up, we are going to be late." Gu Huayu nodded, turned around and blessed King Chi, "Thank you now, King Chi." Then she said to everyone, "Thank you everyone, I'll take the first step." Gu Huayu straightened up, saw Shi Yamei standing next to Lu Yu, and ran over. Took Shi Yamei and walked towards the carriage. Shi Yamei asked in a low voice, "Lulu picked you up, what are you dragging me for?" Gu Huayu asked in a low voice, "If you don't come with us, do you want to stay and have lunch with King Chi?" Shi Yamei shook his head, "Of course not." "That's it, let's go quickly." The two quickly got into the carriage next to Lu Zikan. After Lu Zikan and the other 2 got on the bus, he told Rugjuan to drive away first. When Rugjuan drove away, Lu Zikan turned around and bowed to everyone, "We still have something to do, let's go first. See you later." After saying that, Lu Zikan walked towards the car in which Gu Huayu came. "Wait," when Lu Zikan was about to get in the car, King Chi shouted. Lu Zikan stopped, turned around and looked at King Chi, leaned forward and said, "What are your instructions from King Chi?" King Chi asked, "Where are you going?" Lu Zikan leaned forward and said, "Go back to your lord, this is my private matter. Please forgive me for having no comment." "Private matters," King Chi's voice was extremely cold. Lu Zikan responded without being humble or arrogant, "Back to your lord, yes." King Chi frowned and said, "So, you are very familiar with Yan Ran." Lu Zikan leaned forward and said, "Your Majesty, this is also my private matter. Please forgive me for having no comment. Is there anything else, Your Majesty? If not, I will leave." King Chi shook out the folding fan in his hand, shook it twice vigorously, and said, I don't care whether you are familiar with Yan Ran or not. From now on, please keep a distance from Yan Ran. As King Chi spoke, everyone present looked at Lu Zikin. Some were worried, some were gloating, and some were watching the show. Lu Zikin raised his head, looked at King Chi coldly, and asked without giving in, why? Just because you are the prince? I'm sorry that I can't obey my order. King Chi blurted out, because I have taken a liking to her, no one else can get involved in what I have taken a liking to. Lu Zikin sneered and said, Your Majesty, are you trying to rob or plunder? I just robbed it, what can you do? Lu Zikin twitched the corner of his mouth, sneered, and then said sternly, I am by Xiao's side. Why don't you, King Chi, try to steal one? You can also let the people present see, can King Chi succeed? All of you help be a witness. Speaking, Lu Zikin looked at Zhang Ying and others. You are not willing to go against me, instead of keeping a distance from Yan Ran. Is there an engagement between Prince Ji and Xiao? Or did the prince get the marriage from the emperor? Neither of them. Why does the prince ask me to keep a distance from Xiao? Because she has caught my eye, I can grant her the position of princess. Li Cheng and Li Yi shouted at the same time, Your Majesty. King Chi turned around and glared at the two of them, waved his hand and said, Don't argue, you two. Li Yi shut her mouth in embarrassment. Lu Zikin smiled dryly and said, Your Majesty, these are just your thoughts? Your Majesty doesn't need to tell me this. The only thing I care about is Xiao's thoughts. Lu Zikin said in a roundabout way in front of everyone that King Chi was wishful thinking, which made King Chi angry and said, LV Lu, please note this for me. Lu Zikin leaned forward and said, Okay, I would like to listen to King Chi's instructions and remember them carefully. 6 years ago, I was able to return to the capital alive and I was not afraid of anyone. No matter it's a dirty trick or a conspiracy, just use whatever tricks King Chi has. After saying that, Lu Zikin turned around, got on the car, and told Qing Yu, let's go. Everyone looked at Lu Zikin's car leaving, looking at each other in confusion. You looked at me, I looked at you. It's not their fault that they were surprised, but it's just that there was too much information in Lu Zikin's words. King Chi looked at the carriage going away in shock. He only learned about what happened 6 years ago recently. Lu Zikin actually knew who did it? How did he know? Didn't the mother-in-law say that everything had been dealt with from beginning to end? Lin Wangshu came to his senses first, looked at everyone, and said, Shall we go too? Lin Wangshu's words brought King Chi back to his senses. The king of Qi turned around and cupped his hands towards Pan Junian and said, Thank you very much for today, sir. I'm going back first. I'll come back to you for tea another day. Pan Junian bowed to say goodbye. My lord, walk slowly. Chang Ying of the Qi dynasty said, I still have something to do, so I will stop here today. Let's meet again another day. When things got like this, Zhang Ying knew that King Qi would not be interested in staying for a meal, so she stopped trying to persuade him to stay. She just leaned forward and said, My lord, please go away slowly. Let's meet again later. King Qi nodded and said to Sun Ning, who was waiting with him, Let's go. Sun Ning hurriedly turned around and gave instructions. Seeing King Qi leaving, Li Cheng hurriedly bowed his hands to Zhang Ying and others, and said apologetically, Let's meet again another day. After saying that, Li Cheng got on his horse, caught up with King Qi, and followed King Qi's carriage. Lu Yu looked at the people left behind and asked, What are we going to do next? Are we still going to Fan Tower? Li Tao was upset by today's events. How could he be in the mood to go to Fanlu? He just said, I will send the two sisters back home, and we will meet again another day. After finishing speaking, Li Tao said impatiently to Li Yi and Li Yishan, You two get in the car quickly. Li Yi was immersed in King Chi's words about Su Guhua talking about being a princess and secretly felt sad. King Chi's words made her hear her own heartbroken voice. When she was a child, the imperial concubine asked her whether it would be good to be brother Jingyan's daughter-in-law when she grew up. At that time, she didn't even understand what a daughter-in-law was. Her mother-in-law told her that she would always be with Jingyan. She nodded immediately. Over the years, she kept the concubine's words in mind and waited for King Chi to marry her into the palace. Today, King Chi promised Hua Yanran the position of princess in front of her. What about her? Who is she? She has been in love with him for many years, and has been waiting for him foolishly for many years. Her heart and eyes are filled with him. But in the end, he planned to marry someone else into the family. What should she do? Li Yi looked ahead blankly, thinking hard about what to do. Seeing Li Yi's distracted look, Li Tao sighed slightly, stepped forward, and pulled her forward. What are you thinking about? I'm home. Li Yi came back to her senses and said aggrievedly and helplessly, second brother, what should I do? Li Tao turned his head to look at Li Yi, swallowed back the words he wanted to scold, and comforted him in a low voice, be more liberal, it's not a big deal. After the Li brothers and sisters left, Zhang Ying looked at Zhang Xinran, Ran, what are your plans next? Zhang Xinran was so excited watching the play that she wished she could go home immediately and tell her gossipy mother, I'll go back by myself, brother, don't worry about me. Zhang Ying said to Lu Yu and Lin Wangshu, then let's go have a drink. Today's events had a huge impact on Lu Yu and Lin Wangshu, and they both needed a drink to calm down their shock. The three of them met to go to Fan Tower. The table was booked in advance. After the three people arrived, the waiter began to pass the dishes around. After a while, the whole table was filled with dishes. Zhang Ying sent the people out and poured wine for Lu Yu and Lin Wangshu himself. Come on, let's have a drink first. The three of them picked up the cups, raised their heads and drank it all in one gulp. Lin Wangshu put down his cup and asked, what do you mean by Qingyan's words? He returned to Beijing alive 6 years ago. Did he encounter an accident while traveling 6 years ago? Zhang Ying poured the wine and said, 9 times out of 10, something happened. But why did King Chi attack Qingyan? He is not a prince. Lin Wangshu sighed and said, it may not be King Chi who did it. How old was King Chi 6 years ago? But it is also possible. After all, Qingyan is the cousin of King Xian, and he must be favored by the emperor. Zhang Ying nodded, yes, come and drink this cup. Lu Yu asked, when did Qingyan meet Princess Yanran? Zhang Ying shook her head, I don't know. He has been traveling abroad these years. I haven't met him since he returned to Beijing. Lu Yu looked at Lin Wangshu, and Lin Wangshu shook his head, although I have met Qingyan, I didn't know that he had a personal relationship with the princess. Looking at today's situation, the relationship between Qingyan and the princess is extraordinary. The princess' trust in Qingyan is like a good friend who has known her for many years. Lu Yu leaned back on the chair, tapping the armrest with his fingers, squinting his eyes slightly and not knowing what to think. Zhang Ying said to Lu Yu, look at you, you look so scheming. What do you think of today's matter? Lu Yu sat up straight, picked up a piece of beef with chopsticks, put it on the plate in front of him, and said, I haven't been in the capital for a few years, and I don't know much about the capital. What can I say? Zhang Ying saw Lu Yu playing Tai Chi and said, you are always insightful when it comes to people and things, so just say a few words. Lin Wangshu echoed, yes, you can just say whatever you want. Lu Yu ate the beef on the plate and said, the king of Qi and Qingyan have not been fighting each other for a day or two. Before, King Qi just disliked Qingyan. In the future, King Qi is afraid that he will target Qingyan in everything. Lin Wangshu asked, because of Princess Yanran. Zhang Ying nodded and said, We have known King Chi for many years, but we have never seen him be so interested in any woman. Lin Wangshu said, Qin Jian is not the same. Before, Qin Jian would always approach a woman when he saw her, fearing that she would avoid her. The way Qin Jian treated the princess today was full of tenderness. Especially the smile on his face, I am fascinated by it as an adult. How many years have we known Qin Jian? We have been playing together with him since we were little kids. Who have you ever seen him smile at like this? Princess Yan Ran has fallen into his heart, so it's no wonder he wants to marry Qi Wangang. Zhang Ying picked up the wine glass, took a sip of wine, and sighed, beauty is a disaster. The capital will be in trouble. Lu Yu took the words and said, you can't say that. The capital is too peaceful and has little to do with Hanjian. End of this chapter. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 273. Chapter 273 Fearless. King Qi returned to Prince Qi's mansion, got off the car and strode to the study room in rapid strides. Li Cheng dismounted, threw the reins to his servants, and hurried to catch up. The two of them entered the study one after another. Sun Ning brought tea and carefully placed it on the low table. He raised his head and looked at Li Cheng. Li Cheng waved to him, and Sun Ning hunched over and stepped back. After King Qi walked around the study room twice irritably, he walked to the desk and sat down. As soon as he sat down, King Qi stood up irritably. He said, no, I have to go to the palace and ask my father to marry me. Li Cheng hurriedly spoke to stop him, Your Majesty, this is a critical period, so we must not be rash. It is not too late to enter the palace calmly and thoughtfully before entering the palace. Do not rush into the palace and lose your manners in front of the emperor. After listening to Li Cheng's words, King Qi calmed down a lot. He is the one who is going to inherit the throne, how can he lose his manners in front of his father? King Qi sat down again and said, Qing Chuan, you are right. I, the king, must not be impulsive and must think twice before acting. Li Cheng was slightly relieved when he saw King Qi sitting down. He brought the teacup on the low table in front of the soft couch to the desk and said, Your Majesty, take a sip of tea first. King Qi picked up the teacup and took a sip of tea. He looked up at Li Cheng and said, Qing Chuan, you said that I will go to the palace to ask my father to marry me. Do you think my father will agree? Li Cheng thought for a while and said, Your Majesty has reached the age of getting married early. Your Majesty asked the emperor for a marriage, and the emperor was naturally happy. But the important thing about marriage is to marry two surnames. In addition to the permission of the emperor and the empress, the prince also needs the permission of the other party. The king of Qi said, Does the other party agree? Looking at the capital, how many families want to marry their daughters into the Prince of Qi's palace? I am a noble prince and marry her as a princess. Shouldn't she be grateful? Li Cheng nodded, if it were an ordinary family, and they knew that the prince was willing to marry his daughter as the princess, the whole family would definitely be filled with joy. Because they knew how much glory their daughter would bring to the entire family if she married into Prince Qi's palace. But Princess Yan Ran is different. The king of Qi interrupted Li Cheng and asked, What's the difference? Li Cheng has long been accustomed to King Qi's quick temper. He said, Princess Yan Ran has no parents and no brothers. Isn't there also Huaruiming? Li Cheng shook his head and said, after Princess Yan Ran's life story was revealed, Mrs. Lu and Huaruiming both came to pick up Princess Yan Ran. They wanted to take Princess Yan Ran to live in Hua Mansion, but Princess Yan Ran refused. We don't understand why Princess Yan Ran rejected Huaruiming's invitation, but one thing is certain. That is because Princess Yanran does not want to have too much contact with Huaru Iming. Princess Yanran is unwilling to associate with the current Hua mansion, so how can she care about whether the Hua mansion is glorious? King Qi nodded slightly, thought for a moment, and asked, didn't her adoptive parents come to the capital with her? It is said that the Gu family treated her very well, so she didn't want the Gu family to be glorious. Li Cheng shook his head slightly. It can be seen from the Gu family's attitude towards Princess Yanran that this family is generous and compassionate. Such families do not have high material requirements. They pay more attention to inner things and care about their children's feelings. This is how Princess Yanran develops a high-spirited, free, and uninhibited temperament. Nowadays, Princess Yanran is the princess. At home, she is afraid that Princess Yanran will do whatever she says and follow Princess Yanran's wishes in everything. What's more, Gu Jiaban is a commoner, he doesn't have much experience, and he doesn't know much about power. King Qi thought for a while and said, according to your wishes, this marriage requires Yanran's personal nod. Li Chen nodded, this is how I see it. If the prince wants to marry Princess Yanran as his concubine, he needs Princess Yanran to nod in agreement before he can ask the emperor for marriage. I can't persuade my father to issue an edict directly. My father has issued an edict, how can she not obey it? Li Cheng looked at King Qi but did not reply. King Qi waved his hand and said, I just said it casually, you don't have to take it seriously. Tell me, what should I do? Only Yanran is willing to marry me. Li Cheng shook his head, little girls like Princess Yanran, I really don't know what they want. King Qi circled around the room again. After a few circles, King Qi turned to look at Li Cheng and said, Qing Chuan, let someone go and find out what Yanran likes. This king can't lose to Lulu anymore. Also, I want to send Lulu out and don't want him to stay in the capital. Li Cheng leaned forward and said, it is not impossible to let Zikin leave the capital. However, Zikin is currently preparing for the exam and is preparing to end up next year. If you want Zikin to leave the capital, you have to wait until after the scientific examination. With Zikin's knowledge, he will definitely be a high school student. After Zikin went to high school, I just wanted to entrust him with a foreign job. King Qi murmured, there is still half a year left for the scientific examination. This king will tolerate him for half a year. Hurry and send people to inquire about Yanran's daily preferences. The more detailed the better, and ask them to report them every day and report them all to me. By the way, Brother Tao and Yanran are on good terms. Let Brother Tao go look for Yanran more and then report the itinerary. King Qi immediately became energetic when he thought that Li Tao and Gu Huayu were close. Li Cheng leaned forward and said, I'll tell Brother Tao when I get back. King Qi wiped away his previous bad mood and said, I need to go into the palace to discuss this matter with my mother and concubine. You can explain it to me and go find out Yanran's preferences as soon as possible. Lao Wu now has the support of the Wang Xiangfu, and he has already overwhelmed me in the situation. The marriage between me and Hua Yanran needs to be settled as soon as possible. Li Chen wanted to say something, but after thinking about it for a while, he finally swallowed his words, leaned forward and said, okay, I understand. Rugjuan drove the car to the backyard of Chang'an restaurant, turned around and said to Gu Huayu and Shi Yamei in the car, Princess, the third lady is here. Gu Huayu opened the curtain and jumped out of the car, looked around and asked, are we here at Chang'an restaurant? Rugjuan leaned forward and said, yes, I ordered you to come here first. Shopkeeper Miao rushed over after hearing the news, bowed to Gu Huayu and Shi Yamei and said, hello, Princess, hello third miss, the private room is ready. The uncle just arrived. Princess and third miss, please come here. Shi Yamei asked in surprise, Ming Hao is here too. She was also worried that it would be awkward to face Gu Huayu and Lulu alone. Shopkeeper Miao leaned back and said, yes, I came over as soon as I got off the office. As soon as shopkeeper Miao finished speaking, Yaminghao's voice sounded at the door, "Yame, princess." Gu Huayu returned the courtesy to Yaminghao and said, "You two go to the private room first, I'll wait for brother Zikan here." Shi Yame wanted to wait with her, but was pulled away by Yaminghao. Gu Huayu waited for less than half a quarter of an hour and saw Qingyu hurried into the backyard. Lu Zikan got out of the car and saw Gu Huayu standing on the porch looking at him with a smile. He walked over a few steps and asked, "Why are you standing here on such a hot day?" Gu Huayu looked up at Lu Zikan and replied, "Waiting for you." Lu Zikan took the handkerchief from Gu Huayu's hand and wiped her sweat. He said warmly, "It's hot outside, just wait for me inside." Gu Huayu shook her head and said, "It's different. I want you to be able to see me as soon as you get out of the car." Lu Zikan was warmed by Gu Huayu's words. He pinched the tip of her nose and said dotingly, "You're so good. Let's go in." After saying that, Lu Zikan reached out to hold Gu Huayu's hand. Gu Huayu nodded, put her hand in Lu Zikan's, and the two of them walked side by side to the second floor. Gu Huayu asked as she walked, "King Qi didn't make things difficult for you, did he?" Lu Zikan turned his head and looked at Gu Huayu. "What? Are you worried about me?" Gu Huayu looked at Lu Zikan's eyes and nodded, "Yes, he is the prince after all, and his status lies there." Lu Zikan held Gu Huayu's hand tightly and said, "You are my greatest confidence. As long as you stand by my side, he can't embarrass me." "Xiao, you will always stand by my side, right?" The last sentence, Lu Zikan asked cautiously. Gu Huayu pursed her lips and smiled, "What? Are you worried that I will leave you?" Lu Zikan stared at Gu Huayu and asked, "Can you do it? He is the prince after all. Where is his identity?" Gu Huayu shook her head and said bluntly, "No, my heart is with you." Lu Zikan pulled Gu Huayu's hand, held her in his arms, lowered his head and kissed Gu Huayu's hair. "Xiao, I swear, I will never let you down in this life." Gu Huayu looked up at Lu Zikan and asked with a smile, "Is this the rest of my life?" Lu Zikan immediately changed his words and said, "If there is reincarnation in the world, then I will only love you for the rest of my life." "Really?" Gu Huayu asked, raising her eyebrows. Lu Zikan lowered his head and looked at Gu Hua and said, "My sincerity can be seen from the sun and the moon, but you don't believe me, little guy." "Hang hang, what is that?" Gu Huayu hurriedly separated from Lu Zikan, stood up straight, lowered her head and smoothed her hair in embarrassment. Lu Zikan turned to look at shopkeeper Miao and asked with a stern face, "What's wrong? Are you suffering from the cold?" Shopkeeper Miao hurriedly leaned over and said, "Master, my young body is very strong, how can I catch the wind and cold? It's someone from the Qingqiu palace who said that Unicorn in the palace is looking for me." Gu Huayu raised her head and looked at Lu Zikan, and asked, "Which palace does Unicorn belong to?" LV Zikan replied, "People from Qianqing Palace, people who serve the emperor. The emperor has something to ask you for." Lu Zikan nodded, "Probably, you go upstairs to eat first, and I'll go back to Duke Qingqiu's mansion first, and I'll come find you later." Gu Huayu nodded, "Go ahead. When you're done, you can go directly to Wutong Lane to find me. I'll go back after dinner." "Okay, I know, you go up." After saying that, Lu Zikan walked out. Gu Huayu watched Lu Zikan leave, then turned and went upstairs. Seeing her coming in alone, Shi Yame asked, "Where's Lulu? Didn't you get it?" Gu Huayu walked to the table and sat down. "Brother Zikan has returned to Duke Qingqiu's mansion. Unicorn from the palace went to Duke Qingqiu's mansion to look for him." Yaminghao understood and took the words, "Maybe the emperor has something to do with Zikan. You are all hungry, let's eat." During the dinner, Shi Yame rambled on about what happened in Panyuan. Although Yaminghao was shocked, he calmly comforted Gu Hua and said, "Princess, don't worry, Zikan will take care of these things as long as Zikan is here." Shiyame asked worriedly, if King Chi comes to be tough, how can Mr. Lulu defeat him? He is the prince. Ye Minghao smiled and said, have you ever heard of a saying? Those who are barefoot are not afraid of those who wear feet. Just because Zikin is nothing, he is fearless. King Chi is the prince, he has his power and his concern. Shiyame nodded, that's right. Gu Huayu did not expect Ye Minghao to trust Lu Zikin so much, and then thought about Lu Zikin putting the Ye family first in everything. Sure enough, the sincere feelings are mutual, and this is family. Gu Huayu smiled and said, thank you Mr. Ye, I'm not worried. After dinner, Ye Minghao had to rush back to handle official duties, while Gu Huayu and Shiyame went back to their respective homes. When Lu Zikin returned to Qingqiu Mansion, Eunuch Lin had already drank 2 cups of tea. Lu Zikin hurriedly apologized, I'm sorry, I kept my father-in-law waiting for so long. Eunuch Lin leaned forward and said, it's okay, Mr. Lu, don't worry about it. Our family has been ordered by the Emperor to invite Mr. Lu to accompany our family to the palace. The Emperor has something to see Mr. Lu. Lu Zikin's heart tightened. Could it be that King Chi has already entered the palace? LV Zikin leaned forward and said, my father-in-law, please wait a moment while I change my clothes. Eunuch Lin leaned forward and said, okay, our family will wait here. Lu Zikin returned to Zizuyuan, changed his clothes, and entered the palace with Eunuch Lin. Going to the gate of Qianqing Palace, Eunuch Gao met Lu Zikin. He took 2 steps forward and bowed and said, 6th Master is here, haven't you had lunch yet? Long Live Master is waiting for 6th Master to have lunch. Lu Zikin bowed and thanked him. The Emperor invited him to have a meal with him, which was a great favor. Eunuch Gao took Lu Zikin to the imperial study. Lu Zikin was waiting at the door, waiting for Eunuch Gao to go in and report. After a while, Xian Lu Zikin's voice came from the room. Lu Zikin entered the room and knelt down to pay homage to the Emperor. The Emperor put down the fold in his hand and said, Ping Shen, give me a seat. The Chamberlain immediately stepped forward and placed the brocade stool, then stepped aside. LV Zikin stood up and sat down after thanking him. Seeing the joy in the Emperor's face, his tense heart relaxed a little. The Emperor looked at Lu Zikin and asked, come here from Duke Qingqiu's mansion? Are the injuries on your body healed? Lu Zikin leaned forward and replied truthfully, back to the Emperor, the wounds on his body are almost healed. When Eunuch Lin left, Ziai Qin was going to Chang'an restaurant for lunch with Princess Yan Ran, his eldest cousin and Miss Shi San. After receiving the report, Zikin entered the palace with Eunuch Lin. He asked the Emperor to punish him for keeping him waiting for a long time. The Emperor smiled and said, what's the point of punishment? You didn't know beforehand that I would send you to the palace. Your Majesty, lunch is ready. Eunuch Gao came in and reported. The Emperor stood up and said to Lu Zikin, let's go. Lu Zikin thanked him, got up and followed the Emperor to the side hall. The Emperor sat down and said, sit down, today I have the blood duck and rice noodles you like. Lu Zikin bowed to thank him and sat down at the lower end. After finishing the meal, I drank 2 cups of tea. The Emperor said, Zikin hasn't played chess with me for a few days. Will you play a game with me today? Lu Zikin leaned forward and said, Your Majesty, you have to let Ziai Qin go, otherwise Ziai Qin is afraid of losing to Ugly. The Emperor smiled and said, I haven't seen you for a few days, and Zikin always says good things, and he has grown a lot. Lu Zikin smiled and followed the Emperor to the imperial study. Back in the imperial study, the Emperor walked straight to the chess table and sat down, pointing to the opposite side, sit. Lu Zikin thanked him and sat down. When he saw Eunuch Gao sending the maids and chamberlains out of the room, he felt nervous again. Lu Zikin withdrew his gaze and focused on playing chess. End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every Chapter 274. Chapter 274 King Chi's Plan. After the game of chess was played, the emperor stood up and said, "I came to you today not just to play chess, but I also have something to tell you." Hearing that the emperor had something to say, Luzikin's heart tightened instantly. He was thinking quickly about countermeasures. If the evil king of Qi complained first and the emperor held him to account, how should he respond? Luzikin was thinking about it, stood up and bowed and said, "Your Majesty, please give me your instructions." Before Luzikin could straighten up, he heard the emperor say, "The day after tomorrow is the queen's 40th birthday, please go to Qingcheng Temple for me to perform a 7-day salvation ceremony for the queen." Luzikin was stunned for a moment, then bowed and said, "Zikin obeys the order. My uncle and my eldest cousin took a 7-day leave and plan to go to Cin Temple with my grandmother tomorrow to perform a 7-day Dharma ceremony for the empress." The emperor nodded. "I know that over the years since the queen has been away, every year on the 9th day of July, the old lady will go to Cin Temple to perform puja for the queen. They do theirs, and you do yours for me." Luzikin bowed and responded, "Yes, Zikin understands." The emperor nodded. "Go down, Gaolin, and help me deliver Zikin." Luzikin exited the imperial study. Eunuch Gao sent Luzikin out. Seeing that he was about to speak but hesitated, he asked, "Does Mr. Lu have anything to ask our family?" Luzikin hesitated for a moment and then said, "Eunuch, your Majesty, why do you choose Qingcheng Temple instead of the Daxiakuo Temple when you perform the ritual for your empress?" Eunuch Gao replied, "The reason why the emperor chose Qingcheng Temple is because the empress liked to go to Qingcheng Temple to offer incense during her lifetime." Luzikin understood, bowed to Eunuch Gao and said, "Thank you, Eunuch. Zikin understands." Eunuch Gao said, "Your Majesty's birthday is the day after tomorrow, and the ceremony needs to start tomorrow afternoon." Zikin said, "Don't worry, father-in-law." Zikin left the palace and was ready to leave in a day or two. He rushed to Qingcheng Temple today to prepare some affairs in advance. Eunuch Gao leaned forward and said, "Thank you for your hard work, Master 6. Luzikin leaned back and said, "You are so polite, father-in-law. Your Majesty is Zikin's aunt. It is Zikin's duty to do these things." Zikin said goodbye to Eunuch Gao, turned around and walked towards the palace gate. Luzikin left on the front foot, and someone on the back foot reported Luzikin's departure from Jianqing Palace to Huaqing Palace. "Mother, Master Lulu has just left the palace." The imperial concubine asked, "Do you know why the emperor summoned him?" The chamberlain leaned forward and said, "Go back to your Majesty, I don't know about this." When the emperor was with Lulu, Eunuch Gao sent everyone out, leaving Eunuch Gao alone to wait in the room, so that the slave family could not inquire. The imperial concubine waved her hand and said, "Go down." The chamberlain leaned down and got down. King Qi asked, "Mother, concubine, what do you think my father called Lulu into the palace for?" The imperial concubine shook her head. "Your Majesty never talks to me about the matters related to the Qingqiu Palace, and I can't even guess." The imperial concubine looked at Prince Qi with sharp eyes. "Your Majesty, be careful what you say and don't criticize the emperor." The king of Qi leaned forward and said, "Thank you very much, my mother and concubine, for your teaching. I will take note of it." The imperial concubine asked, "Your Majesty, you came into the palace today. Did you have something to do with me?" "Back to my mother and concubine, I have something to discuss with my mother and concubine when I enter the palace this time." Seeing King Qi's careful look, the imperial concubine asked, "What's the matter?" King Qi looked at the servants beside the imperial concubine. The imperial concubine came over understandingly, raised her hand and waved, and Lu Shanggong took the maid out. After the imperial concubine and others retreated, she asked again, "What's the matter?" King Qi looked at the imperial concubine and said, After my father granted marriage to Lao Wu and Miss Wang San, the situation in the court was very unfavorable to my son. Speaking of this matter, the imperial concubine frowned. This was what worried her the most. After learning about the marriage between the British Duke and the Prime Minister's office, she spent a lot of effort to get the Prime Minister's office to cancel the marriage. The imperial concubine had just relaxed for a few days when she received another letter from the emperor granting marriage to Lao Wu. The imperial concubine knew that Yongning Palace was restless, but she never thought that concubine would choose Wang Piyun as her daughter-in-law, and concubine was not afraid of looking ugly. The imperial concubine asked, "What are your plans, your majesty?" King Qi said, "Lao Wu can use the method of marriage to increase his help. Is it not a good idea for my sons and ministers? If my sons and ministers learn from this, I will do what Lao Wu did. The son is older than the fifth son, and the fifth son's marriage has been arranged. The father should be willing to grant the son a marriage." The imperial concubine nodded and agreed, "Well, this is a good idea. I will arrange this matter. I will mention it to the emperor later. Let your aunt come into the palace to talk to me and tell your aunt what you want so that they can be prepared." King Qi immediately stopped him and said, "Wait a minute, concubine." The imperial concubine looked at King Qi and asked doubtfully, "What's wrong?" King Qi did not dare to look at the imperial concubine. He turned his face away from the imperial concubine and said, "I have been weighing it for a long time. I must be careful about my marriage. It is a major matter for me." The imperial concubine was stunned for a moment and asked, "Your Majesty, you don't want to marry Yi as your concubine?" The king of Qi felt so guilty that he did not dare to look at the imperial concubine. "The matter of Lao Wu's marriage made me want to understand a lot. Concubine, think about it, if Lao Wu has a foreign family like the British Duke, why would he marry into the Prime Minister's palace? Why?" King Qi looked at the imperial concubine and said, "Because the outside family is on his own side whether they marry or not, and getting married to her will only be a waste of resources. Yi is Urchin's cousin. She grew up with Urchin since childhood. Urchin's affection for Yi is naturally deep. If possible, I would also like to marry Yi as my concubine. But the current situation does not allow my son to do this. A British prince's palace has already caused headaches for his subjects, and now the addition of a prince's palace has made it difficult for his subjects to move in the court. The mother and concubine also know that the king has been an official for many years and has been the prime minister for 8 years, and has a great influence in the court. Sons and ministers must increase their power through marriage. Yi here, the son and ministers cannot allow her to be the concubine, so they can only let her down. If Yi is willing, I can grant her the position of concubine. One day, when I ascend to the throne, I can grant her the position of noble concubine." Of course, Yi Yuruo felt aggrieved and was unwilling to marry into Prince Qi's palace. She was still Urchin's sister, and Urchin gave her a large gift as a dowry. The king of Qi's misfortune made the imperial concubine extremely distressed. Although Li Yi is the niece that the concubine has watched since she was a child, compared with her own son, the concubine's heart naturally favors her son. Your uncle and aunt are both people who take the overall situation into consideration. I don't think they will blame you. As for Yi, let me talk to her later. I also listen to her thoughts. If she can endure this grievance and marry into the palace, I will treat her favorably. Your Majesty is right. Has your Majesty decided which family to marry? Prime Minister Jiang's mansion or Prime Minister Zhao's mansion? In the eyes of the imperial concubine, those who can compete with the king are Prime Minister Jiang and Prime Minister Zhao. King Qi shook his head. "No, all the direct sons in Prime Minister Zhao's mansion are young masters, and there is currently no suitable woman in Prime Minister Jiang's mansion." The concubine briefly went through the Zhao family and the Jiang family in her mind, and it was indeed the case. Asked, "What should I do?" Seeing that the imperial concubine had listened, King Qi raised his hand to refill the tea for the imperial concubine. While pouring the tea, he said, I have been thinking about this for a long time, and I can't think of a suitable person for the moment. Is there anyone who can be chosen by the imperial concubine at any time? How can it be so easy to find a house that can be compared with Wang Xiangfu? The imperial concubine mentioned several families, but she felt bad about it and vetoed it herself. The noble concubine of the Qi dynasty bowed and said, Thank you, concubine. My son and minister are unfilial, so I always let my concubine worry about my son. The imperial concubine shook her head slightly and said, I only have your son. If I don't plan for you, who will I plan for? The king of Qi stood up, bowed deeply to the imperial concubine, and solemnly thanked him, Thank you very much, concubine. The imperial concubine waved her hands and said worriedly, What should I do with the prince's marriage? If I had known this, I should have proposed marriage to the prime minister's mansion earlier. King Qi looked at the imperial concubine and asked, Does the imperial concubine know anything about Lan Jingwei? The imperial concubine straightened her back and asked with a slight frown, Long Shadow Guards? Isn't Huaruiming the leader of Long Shadow Guards? Long Shadow belongs to the British government. What? Do you want to take advantage of Long Shadow Guards? King Qi picked up the teacup and took a sip of tea, then put down the teacup and said, It's because the Long Shadow Guards are from the British Duke's line that I want to start here. The imperial concubine looked at King Qi and motioned for him to continue. King Qi looked at the imperial concubine and continued, Hua Yanran and Huaruiming are not willing to deal with the news that I have found out. Besides, the Long Shadow Guards are not simple. Oh? What's not a simple solution? Tell me about it. The imperial concubine sat up straight and looked at King Qi and said. King Qi continued, Hualing died suddenly, so in order to stabilize the situation, my father appointed Huasu as the commander of the Long Shadow Guard. But Huasu was not recognized by the superiors and subordinates of Lunjing Guard. Urchin heard that the reason why the Lunjing Guards did not recognize Huasu was because Huasu did not have the dragon mark order in his hand. The imperial concubine asked, What is the dragon pattern order? King Qi nodded and said, This is the token held by the head of the Lanjingwei family. The Hua family's ancestral saying is that seeing the dragon pattern is like seeing the head of the family. When a new head of the family takes office, he needs to hold a dragon-marked order in order to gain the approval of the Dragon Shadow Guards, but Huasu does not have a dragon-marked order. The imperial concubine said, That's not right, Lanjingwei is a gangster gang, and gangsters have their own rules. Since Huasu didn't have the dragon mark order, how did he become the commander of the Dragon Shadow Guard? He will still be the commander of the Dragon Shadow Guard until his death. King Qi shook his head, I don't know this. I heard that Huasu was stabbed to death by Hualing's former subordinate. Before Huasu died, he sent people to the Hua family's old house in Jiangnan to look for the dragon pattern order. The people he sent had a fight with the people guarding the old house, and many people died. Only then was Huasu assassinated. He has been the leader for 10 years, why is he still holding on to a dragon pattern order? Does this dragon pattern order have any secrets? The imperial concubine asked with a solemn expression. King Qi was surprised by the imperial concubine's sensitivity and nodded, my son thought so too. There must be a secret to this dragon pattern order. The imperial concubine thought deeply, what secret could it be? Do you think the emperor knows about it? King Qi shook his head, I don't know, but looking at my father's attitude towards Hua Yanran, my father should know. The imperial concubine asked in surprise, what do you mean, your lord, that Hua Yanran has a dragon pattern order? King Qi nodded, my son has asked people to check that several people around Hua Yanran were once members of the Dragon Shadow Guard. If Hua Yanran didn't have the dragon pattern order, those people would not gather around her. The concubine looked up at King Qi and asked, does the prince want to marry Hua Yanran? King Qi nodded and said, the mother-in-law understands her son best, and the power of the Long Shadow Guard cannot be underestimated. Hua Yanran and Hua Ruiming couldn't deal with each other, so the son married Hua Yanran and took advantage of Hua Yanran's relationship to take Long Yingwei into his hands, taking the opportunity to weaken the power of the British government. This is a double win. The imperial concubine pondered for a moment, nodded and said, I understand, I will ask Hua Yanran to come and sit in the palace. King Qi shook his head and stopped, thank you, concubine, but this matter is not urgent. Urchin said this to his mother and concubine today just to let her mother and concubine know what he was thinking. Hua Yanran is not like a young lady who grew up in a wealthy family. Young ladies from a wealthy family have their fathers in charge of their marriages. Hua Yanran has no parents, and her marriage can only be decided by her nodding. I want to get in touch with her first, and after she nods, I will ask my father to grant me a marriage. The imperial concubine thought about Hua Yanran's previous performance in Huaking Palace, and was deeply touched. She said with some worry, Hua Yanran is like a runaway horse. If the prince marries her as the princess, will the palace of Prince Qi be messed up? Qi Wang consoled, mother and concubine are assured that as long as she marries into Qi Wang's mansion, there are ways to make her obedient. The imperial concubine instantly understood what Prince Qi meant, smiled knowingly, and said, that's right, the husband is the wife's guide. As long as she marries into Prince Qi's palace, everything will be out of her control. When King Qi saw that he had convinced the imperial concubine, he was in a good mood and leaned forward and said, it's getting late. I will go to Jianqing Palace to pay my respects to my father. Then it's time to return home. When she heard that her son was going to Jianqing Palace, the imperial concubine nodded happily and said, when you enter the palace, it's time to greet the emperor. Although the emperor is a king, he is also a father. Only by communicating more between father and son can the relationship become closer. The king of Qi leaned forward and said, my son, please remember the teachings of your mother and concubine. In the future, you will go to the palace more often to pay your respects to your father. My mother and concubine will send you greetings. The imperial concubine sent Prince Qi to the gate of Huaking Palace, Your Majesty should have some free time today. Your Majesty will go talk to Your Majesty and play chess or something. Your Majesty usually doesn't talk much. Your Majesty should be more proactive and sweet when talking to Your Majesty. The imperial concubine confessed uneasily that she wished she could follow King Qi to Jianqing Palace. King Qi looked like he had been taught something, and nodded repeatedly, yes, I have recorded it, mother and concubine, please rest assured. The imperial concubine was finally worried and said, Your Majesty, please wait for me. I will go with you to Jianqing Palace. After finishing speaking, the imperial concubine turned to Lu Shanggong beside her and said, go and fill a bowl with the white fungus porridge I cooked, and I will send it to the emperor. The king of Qi originally wanted to persuade his mother and concubine not to bother, but seeing her worried expression, he knew he could not persuade her, so he simply let the concubine follow her. The mother and son took a group of palace maids and chamberlains to the Jianqing Palace. After receiving the report from the chamberlain, the emperor paused while approving the memorial and said to Mr. Gao, I am busy now and let them go back first. I will stay at Huaking Palace tonight. Eunuch Gao was ordered to leave the imperial study and convey the emperor's wishes to the imperial concubine and the king of Qi. When the imperial concubine heard that the emperor was missing, her heart immediately sank to the bottom of her heart. Then she heard that the emperor was staying at Huaking Palace that night, and she was immediately overjoyed. Thank you, father-in-law. I understand. This is the white fungus porridge that I personally cooked. Please pass it on to the emperor. Lu Shanggong saw the opportunity and presented the food box. Eunuch Gao took the food box and said, okay, I will pass it to the emperor now. After thanking the imperial concubine, she turned around and left with King Qi. End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 275. Chapter 275. It's her. After thanking the imperial concubine, she turned around and left with King Chi. Eunuch Gao carried the food box into the imperial study room and said, "Long live the rice fungus porridge cooked by the imperial concubine herself, please let me pass it on to the emperor." The emperor lowered his head to review the papers and said without raising his head, "I reward you." This. The emperor looked up at Eunuch Gao and asked, "What?" Not satisfied. Eunuch Gao hurriedly said, "I don't dare, thank you long live lord for your kindness." After expressing his gratitude, Eunuch Gao put the food box on the low table aside. The emperor put away the last stroke, put down the ink pen, looked up at Eunuch Gao, and asked, "Xiao Linzi, do you think that child is still alive?" Gao Lin leaned forward and said, "Long live my lord, I am the eldest son of the emperor. With the protection of successive emperors, he will definitely seek good fortune and avoid misfortune, and grow up safely and smoothly." The emperor stood up and walked to the window, looked at the imperial garden through the window, and said after a long time, if he were still alive, he would be as big as Zikin. Eunuch Gao leaned forward and said, "Yes." The emperor didn't speak for a long time. After a while, he turned back to the dragon table and sat down, and started reading the book again. Eunuch Gao was waiting carefully on the side. Lu Zikin came out of the palace. He was afraid that Mrs. Jean would be worried, so he went back to the Qingqiu palace to report to Mrs. Jean first. After hearing this, Mrs. Jean sighed and said, "Your Majesty is interested. Ye has been gone for 21 years, and the emperor can still remember her. I should be satisfied that Ye knows about her underground." Mrs. Jean said, "Zikin wants to go to Qingcheng Temple, so he must leave early, otherwise he will have to travel at night." Lv Zikin replied, "Thank you, aunt. Zikin came over to give to my grandmother. After my aunt said goodbye, she set off. It's just that Zikin has been away from Beijing for a few days. Zikin is a little worried about his mother." Mrs. Jean comforted her and said, "Go to your mother's place. I will send someone to pick her up later and ask her to accompany me to Cin Temple to stay for a few days." Lu Zikin leaned forward and said, "This is best. Zikin feels most at ease when his mother is with his grandmother and aunt." Lu Zikin came out of Qingfang courtyard and took Rugjuan and others out in the car. As the car left Qingqiu's mansion, Lu Zikin ordered, "Go around to Wuotong Lane, and I'll go say goodbye to Xiao." Rugjuan bowed his body and responded. As the car drove to Wuotong Lane, Rugjuan asked, "Sir, should I take the main entrance or the side entrance?" Lu Zikin was worried that Gu Huayu was not in his courtyard at this time, so he said, "Go to the main entrance." Gu Huayu and Wang Qin were talking in the study. When they received the notice from the concierge, they were stunned for a moment, then stood up and walked to the door. When Lu Zikin saw Gu Huayu coming out, he pulled her aside and said, "Xiao, I want to go on a long trip." Hearing that Lu Zikin said that he was going on a long trip, Gu Huayu's mood suddenly worsened. Asked, "The emperor asked you to go?" Lu Zikin nodded. Gu Huayu thought that King Qi went to the palace to complain, and the emperor punished Lu Zikin and sent him away. Gu Huayu asked, "Where are you going? How far is it? When will you come back?" Lu Zikin nodded, "Yes, the day after tomorrow is the queen's birthday, and the emperor asked me to go to Qingcheng Temple for him to conduct a 7-day ritual for the queen. I have to rush to Qingcheng Temple today to make arrangements in advance." Well, it was entrusted with important tasks, not sent out. Gu Huayu breathed a sigh of relief and asked, "Why do you want to organize the queen's birthday?" Lu Zikin explained, "Maybe the emperor trusts me. Your Majesty is my biological aunt, so it is reasonable and not unexpected for me to do it." Gu Huayu thought about it and asked, Where is Qingcheng Temple? Is it far away? Luzikin replied, it's more than an hour's drive east of Minjia Villa and we'll almost be there. Gu Huayu raised her hand to look at her watch and said, it's already the time, so hurry up and set off. It will get dark if it's too late. Luzikin nodded, I'm leaving. Take care of yourself these days and wait until I come back. I know, let's go quickly, Gu Huayu urged. As he said that, Gu Huayu pushed Luzikin towards the car. Luzikin said as he walked, Xiao, I am not allowed to go out with King Qi when I am not in the capital. Gu Huayu nodded and said, okay, I'll listen to you and don't go out. Luzikin turned to look at Gu Huayu and continued worriedly, don't go to the casino with Huaru Iming anymore. Stay away from him. I know, I'll stay far away from him, Gu Huayu promised. Luzikin reluctantly boarded the car and warned, Xiao, stay away from Li Tao. I know, you should set off quickly, it will be dark if it's too late. Luzikin felt that Gu Huayu disliked him, so he looked at Gu Huayu pitifully and shouted, Xiao. Through the car window, Gu Huayu looked at the aggrieved Luzikin and asked, what's wrong? I started to miss you before I left, what should I do? Luzikin said, leaning against the car window. Gu Huayu thought for a while and said, wait for me. Luzikin watched Gu Huayu turn and walk towards the door, say a few words to Qingyu, and then walk quickly towards the carriage. Luzikin's heart was filled with anticipation. He stood up and lifted the curtain and shouted excitedly, Xiao. Gu Huayu stretched out her hand, and Luzikin quickly stretched out his hand to hold it. Gu Huayu jumped into the car and said, I'll see you off, and then go to Zhuangzi to stay for a few days. Luzikin held Gu Huayu in his arms and said emotionally, Xiao, you are so kind. Gu Huayu glanced at him charmingly, then raised her voice and told Rugjuan, let's go. Rugjuan responded with a smile, okay. Qingyu drove out. Wang Qin hurriedly shouted, where are you going? Qingyu replied, the princess said that she would go to Zhuangzi to stay for a few days. Wang Qin wondered, didn't you just come back from Zhuangzi? Remember to bring Begonia and Liwa. Qingyu said without looking back, Xinchi will see them off. I will go there first and they will come later. Gu Huayu was worried that it would be dark when Luzikin arrived at Qingcheng Temple, so she urged Rugjuan to hurry up along the way. When Qingyu caught up with him, Rugjuan's car was approaching Minjia Villa. Luzikin said, Xiao, just accompany me to Qingcheng Temple, okay. Gu Huayu was afraid of the temple, shook her head and said, you go to perform a ceremony for the queen, what should I do? I'll wait for you at the villa, and then we'll go back to the city together. Luzikin saw that Gu Huayu was resolute and thought that she would wait for him in Zhuangzi and would not be harassed by King Qi and others, so he left with peace of mind. It was already the end of the Yamo period when Luzikin and his party arrived at Qingcheng Temple. After entering the temple, Luzikin first went to see the abbot and explained his intention to the abbot. After hearing this, the host was filled with joy and agreed with Luzikin not to open the altar on the 8th day of the lunar month. Luzikin came out from the host's place, returned to his residence, had a simple dinner and then rested. The next day, Luzikin got up at Maoshi, washed up and came out. Rugjuan had already laid out breakfast. Luzikin sat down to eat. Sir, the scenery in the back mountain is pretty good, do you want to go and see it? Luzikin thought that the Dharma ceremony would only start in the afternoon, and he had nothing to do in the temple in the morning. Okay, let's go out for a walk. Luzikin took Rugjuan Ruhin to the back mountain. There was a stone road in the back mountain that led to the top of the mountain. On both sides of the stone road are neatly trimmed small bushes. The small bushes are covered with rose flowers. It can be seen from the thick rose vines that these flowers are quite old. Luzikin raised his head and looked up. Wherever he could see, there seemed to be a winding road of roses. What's even better is that there are 2 rows of camphor trees planted not far from the roses. The shade of the camphor trees can block the harsh sun and provide pedestrians with a shade, but will not affect the growth of the roses. Elvizakin said, I should have brought Xiao here, she must like it here. Rugjuan said, Sir, would you like me to go pick up the princess? Luzakin thought for a while and said, forget it, let's go and come back. By the time Xiao comes, it will be already afternoon. I have to be busy with the Dharma conference and can't accompany her. Let's go and have a look at the top of the mountain. The three of them walked up the stone road. There were 2 pavilions along the road for people to rest. The pavilion is also surrounded by roses. Rumo looked at the delicate flowers and said, how much I like roses that I can plant the mountain road full of roses. Rugjuan lowered his head and looked at the shrubs carefully and said, these yellow flowers have not been pruned for a long time. It seems that there are people in the temple who are dedicated to taking care of these flowers. Luzakin took a closer look and said, let's go up. The 3 of them walked straight to the top of the mountain. Ruju walked in front and was the first to reach the top of the mountain. Their eyes widened in shock at the sight in front of them. Wow! Master, come up quickly. This place is so beautiful. Luzakin climbed to the top of the mountain in a few steps. The top of the mountain was like a gentle platform. When he walked to the edge, he saw that the other side of the mountain was covered with roses. Rugjuan sighed, oh my God, this is so beautiful. Sir, look at that place, the shape is the same as the rose in the courtyard of the Chinquo Palace. Rumo pointed to 2 bushes of flowers, one tall and one short, on the left front, which looked like 2 people cuddling together. Luzakin looked over along Rumo's fingers, and was shocked again. It seemed that the flowers and plants here were all taken care of by the emperor. The 3 of them stayed at the top of the mountain for more than half an hour before heading back. Rugjuan sighed, the emperor treats your empress with great affection. Luzakin nodded slightly. The emperor's deep affection made Luzakin feel a little sad. In these years, the emperor had been very miserable, right? Back at the foot of the mountain, the 3 of them passed by a woman wearing smoky gray clothes when they entered the door. Luzakin felt that the woman looked very familiar, as if he had seen her somewhere before, but he couldn't remember it no matter how hard he thought about it. When the woman saw Luzakin and the others, she was startled for a moment, then lowered her head in panic, passed the 3 of them sideways, and went straight up the mountain. When Luzakin returned to the courtyard, Ruhi came over and reported, Sir, the young novice beside the abbot has been here and said that the abbot has invited me. The young novice told me that he went to the back mountain, and the novice asked him to come back when he comes back. Elvizakin nodded and said, okay, I understand. After Luzakin entered the house to change clothes, he took Rugjuan to the host's residence, still thinking about the woman who looked familiar. Arriving at the door of the presiding courtyard, Luzakin suddenly thought, it's her. The person who looked familiar was Weiruo, whom the emperor had asked him to find. Luzakin thought of this and immediately turned around and walked back. Rugjuan, hurry up, let's go back. Rugjuan looked at Luzakin blankly, and asked as he followed Luzakin back, Master, what's wrong? Where are you going back to? What happened? Luzakin walked quickly to the back mountain gate. Go to the back mountain and look for the woman I just met. Rugjuan thought of the woman he met at the gate of Hushan. Okay, sir, who is that woman? Do you know her? Luzakin nodded, it's that old friend, the one we found a few years ago. Rugjuan tightened his body and moved his feet much faster. Master, come from behind. The younger one will go and take a look first. Luzakin nodded and said, when you see her, keep her here and don't hurt her. Rugjuan nodded and said, okay, I understand. Rugjuan hurried to the back mountain. When Luzakin reached the halfway point of the mountain, Rugjuan had already come back from the mountain. He shook his head at Luzakin and said, Master, there is no one there. It seems that the person has left. Luzakin looked around and said, in just one cup of tea, No one was seen. Didn't she go up the mountain? Rugjuan looked around and said, there is only one road here, and there is no other way. Either she went up the mountain, or she turned around and left the temple after we entered the temple. Luzikin frowned slightly and said, so, she knows us, so she avoids us. Rugjuan nodded, it's very possible. Luzikin looked around, turned around, and walked back. Let's go back and ask if anyone is coming to the temple to offer incense today. Rugjuan bowed and responded, okay. I understand, little one. The two returned to the temple, and Luzikin said, I'll go to the abbot first, and you can go and find out. Luzikin went to the abbot's residence and the abbot explained to him the affairs of the Dharma assembly. Luzikin kept Weiruo's affairs in mind and said, the opening of the Dharma conference will be left to the presiding officer. If I need to go back to the city for urgent matters, I will come back later. The donor just arrived yesterday and is going back to the city today. Luzikin leaned forward and said, yes, I have something urgent to deal with. The host nodded, the donor has a safe journey. Luzikin thanked the host and left the room. Going back to his residence, he asked, has Rugjuan come back? Master, the little one is back. Rugjuan's voice came from outside. Luzikin turned to look at him and asked, how is it? Have you found out? Rugjuan leaned forward and said, Master Bai said that the woman planned to come to the temple to hold a 7-day Dharma ceremony. When she learned that the temple had taken over our business, she didn't say much more. She just lit an incense stick in the main hall, and then said went for a walk in the back mountain and didn't see him again. Luzikin was sure that this person was Weiruo, so he said to Rugjuan, you will keep an eye on the altar for me when we open the altar in the afternoon. I will go back to the city, and Ruhin will follow me. We can go back and forth on horseback. It will be faster this way. Yan bowed and responded, okay, I understand. It was already noon when Luzikin and Jin rushed back to the city. Jin asked, Sir, where are we going? Luzikin said, let's go to Qingzhou in Chaijiaping first. Yan responded, okay. Yan rode in front, followed by Luzikin. The two returned to the Qing guest house, and Luzikin ordered, let someone prepare water. I want to take a bath and change clothes. The servants quickly prepared water and brought it over. After Luzikin took a bath and changed clothes, Jin brought a bowl of beef noodles over and said, Master, let's deal with one bite first. Luzikin took it, ate the noodles in twos and twos, and then said, I'm going to the palace. Jin drove Luzikin to the gate of the palace. After Luzikin entered the palace, he went straight to Jianqing Palace. When eunuch Gao saw Luzikin, he asked in surprise, why is Master 6 here? End of this chapter. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 276. Chapter 276 Accident. Luzikin leaned forward and said, hello, sir. Zikin has something to report to the emperor. Please let me know. Eunuch Gao said, the emperor is discussing matters with several prime ministers. Mr. 6 will wait a moment. After saying that, Eunuch Gao turned around and entered the imperial study. Luzikin was waiting outside. Not long after, the 3 prime ministers came out of the imperial study. Luzikin bowed towards the 3 prime ministers. The king glanced at Luzikin and nodded expressionlessly. Zhang Xiang smiled and greeted Luzikin, I haven't seen Zikin in a few days, and Zikin is becoming more and more handsome. Zhao Xiang said a few good words in agreement. LV Zikin leaned forward and said, the 2 prime ministers have given you such praise. Zikin is ashamed. Seeing Prime Minister Zhang, Prime Minister Zhao and Luzikin talking and laughing, Prime Minister Wang's face became even more ugly. He snorted coldly and walked away. Zhang Xiang saw Wang Xiang leave with a sullen face, looked at each other with Zhao, and turned to Lu Ziqin and said, Ziyi Qin comes to the house to play when he has time. I have a box of good melon slices here, which were delivered from Luan a few days ago. Lu Ziqin hurriedly bowed and thanked him. Eunuch Gao came out and preached, Sixth Master, the Emperor has invited you. Lu Ziqin bowed his hands to Prime Minister Zhang and Prime Minister Zhao, and walked to the imperial study. After entering the house to see the ceremony, the emperor gave him a seat. Ziqin sat down and saw that Eunuch Gao had sent the maids and chamberlains out. The emperor looked at Lu Ziqin and asked, Is Ziqin coming back from Qingcheng Temple? Lu Ziqin leaned forward and said truthfully, back to the emperor, yes. Ziqin has just returned from Qingcheng on horseback. The emperor's eyes darkened slightly, riding back. What happened to you in such a hurry to come back? Due to his weak body, Lu Ziqin almost always travels by car and rarely rides a horse. Back to the emperor, yes. Ziqin is in a hurry to come back. He really has something important to report to the emperor. Lu Ziqin looked at the emperor, thinking about how to speak to the emperor. The emperor's eyes were full of expectation. He straightened his back and asked nervously, What's the matter? Lu Ziqin leaned forward and said, This morning, Ziqin, Rugjuan, and Ruhan went to the back hill of Qingcheng Temple for a walk. When I returned to the temple, at the back gate of Qingcheng Temple, I met the woman whom the emperor asked Ziqin to find on Jiangnan East Road 5 years ago. The emperor stood up from the throne with a bang and asked, Where is the person? Where is he now? Lu Ziqin knelt down and said apologetically, I'm back to the emperor, I don't know where I went. The emperor looked at Lu Ziqin, who was kneeling on the ground, and said, Get up. Lu Ziqin expressed his gratitude. The emperor was silent for a moment and asked, I have disappeared? What happened? Please tell me in detail. Lu Ziqin leaned back and said, The scar on the woman's face is gone. When Ziqin saw the woman at first, he thought she looked familiar, but he couldn't remember where he had seen her before. By the time Ziqin got up and chased after her, the woman had already left. Rugjuan went to inquire and found out that the woman was going to the temple to hold a 7-day Dharma ceremony, but because the temple took over our business, the woman was refused. The woman burned incense in the main hall and said she would go for a walk in the back mountain. At that time, Ziqin, Rugjuan, and others were returning to the temple, so they met her at the back mountain gate. The emperor murmured, It's her. It must be her. Lu Ziqin looked at the emperor. The emperor raised his head and looked at Lu Ziqin. Ziqin, do you know who she is? Lu Ziqin leaned forward and said, back to the emperor, it's Wei Ruo, the female official next to the empress, right? The emperor nodded. Did she, Ye Shangshu, tell you? Yes, my grandfather told Ziyi Qin before he died that he must find Wei Ruo and the eldest son of the emperor. The emperor looked at Lu Ziqin and asked, do you think that child is still alive? Lu Ziqin thought for a while and said, it should be alive, otherwise if Wei doesn't protect his master well, he will either die to apologize or remain anonymous and will never show up easily. The emperor asked, if the child is still alive, why didn't Wei Ruo come to find me? And let the royal blood flow outside? Lu Ziqin said, perhaps something happened that we don't know about. What exactly it is, only by finding Wei Ruo can the truth be revealed. The emperor was silent for a moment and said, tell me about Wei Ruo's appearance today. Lu Ziqin thought for a moment and said, today she wore a suit of smoky gray clothes and had her hair styled in a very ordinary woman's bun, tied with a jade hairpin. She looked very neat, her skin was fair, and she should be living a good life. When she saw us, her eyes were a little panicked, and then she lowered her head. Now that I think about it, she must have known Ziqin. It's all because Ziqin was careless and he asked the emperor to punish him. Speaking, Lu Ziqin bowed to the emperor to apologize. The emperor waved his hand and said, I can't blame you for this, and don't blame yourself. Since Wei Ruo showed up at Qingcheng Temple, he must be somewhere else. I have been waiting for it for more than 20 years, and I am not afraid of waiting a few more days. You still have to worry about the Dharma conference, so go down first. Luzikin bowed to say goodbye and left the imperial study. Luzikin came out of the palace, returned to the Qing guest house, and still rode back to Qingcheng Temple. Not long after Luzikin passed by Minjia Villa, King Zhu brought Gu Changjiang, who was tired of travel, to Minjia Villa. When Gu Dichang saw Gu Changjiang, he asked in surprise, "Why are you here, brother Jiang? Is there something going on at home?" Gu Changjiang replied, "Yes, on June 16, my grandfather went to work in the mountains and fell from the Eagle Cliff. Grandfather was already mute when he was carried back. I don't know how long the old man can last. The uncle asked me to inform the third uncle. I rushed all the way to the capital without stopping. It took me more than 20 days to get there. I don't know how my grandfather is doing now." The sudden bad news shocked the family on the spot. Mrs. Ping was the first to come to her senses and said, "Yan Ran, such a big thing happened at home, you have to go back and take a look." Gu Huayu said, "It's time to go back and take a look. Dad, let's discuss how to respond." Gu Dichang had not yet recovered from the shock, and stood there in confusion. Gu Chennan pulled Gu Dichang's sleeve and called, "Third uncle." Gu Dichang came back to his senses, looked up at Gu Huayu, and said, "Xiao, we have to go back." Gu Huayu nodded, "Yes, let's all go back. Now let's discuss whether we should go back together or in batches." Gu Chennan took over and said, "We are a big family, and we are too small. It will definitely not work to go back day and night. We can only go back in batches. My third uncle and I will go back first, and brother Zhang will rest for one night and meet the others come later." Gu Dichang nodded in agreement, looked at Wan Qi and said, "Brother Nan and I will leave first. Later, someone will go to the city to inform brother Gui, brother Liang and the others and ask them to ask for leave from the husband. You can take them behind." Wan Qi nodded in agreement. Gu Huayu said, "My father, my second brother, and I are leaving first." Gu Dichang thought that Gu Huayu knew medical science, and if his old father was still alive, Xiao might be able to help. "Okay, that's settled, Xiao will come with us." Gu Huayu looked at Husan and said, "Eldest sister is still in confinement, so don't go back." Husan bowed and responded, "I will listen to the princess's arrangements." Even though Husan was married to Gu Changqiao, he was still very respectful in front of Gu Huayu. Gu Huayu asked someone to call Mi Chen and explain to Mi Chen. He asked King Yu and Junqi to take one person each to drive the car, and then set off. Mi Chen was worried about Gu Huayu and arranged 8 secret guards to follow him. Gu Huayu, Gu Dichang and Gu Chennan walked all the way under the stars and the moon. When they arrived at Xishan, it was already the first day of August. Gu Chennan said, "Third uncle, do you want to go to Miwen to ask about the situation?" Gu Dichang shook his head, "No, let's go back directly." The group of people passed through the city and headed toward Sanhe town. They walked without stopping all the way until they reached Shangtai village. The carriage met Gu Diki and his party at the entrance of the village, who were returning from shopping in mourning clothes. Gu Dichang and Gu Chennan got out of the car. When Gu Diki saw Gu Dichang, his eyes suddenly turned red and he said, "Third brother, are you back?" When Gu Dichang saw Gu Diki's clothes, all hope in his heart was completely lost. He was filled with sadness and tears suddenly burst into his eyes. Gu Chennan asked with a choked voice, "Second uncle, has my grandfather gone?" Gu Diki raised his hand to wipe away his tears and said, "Third uncle left on the 2nd day of the 29th day of the 7th lunar month." Gu Huayu got out of the car and happened to hear Gu Diki's words. She felt that her limbs were weak and she stumbled forward. King Yu hurriedly stretched out his hand to support her, Princess. Gu Huayu stood up straight with the help of King Yu's hand, and said sadly, I'm still late. Qing Yu hurriedly advised, Princess, people cannot be resurrected after death, so you must express your condolences. Someone called home, and Gu Chengdong and Gu Chenglin came out to greet them. Family members met each other with tears in their eyes. Gu Huayu thought about all the good things her grandfather had done during his lifetime, and knelt down in front of her grandfather and burst into tears. Qin, Fang, and Guan all came to persuade her, but Gu Huayu just stopped and followed Guan back to the house to rest. Not long after Guan left, brother Sui came in looking for her. Sister-in-law, my third uncle asked me to call you over. Gu Huayu nodded and followed brother Sui to the main room. Gu Huayu entered the main room and greeted Gu Difang, Gu Dihe, and others. Everyone hurriedly said that they couldn't do it, and they politely let her take the seat. Gu Huayu insisted not to sit at the top, and after some pushing, she sat next to Gu Dichang. Gu Dichang turned his head and said to Gu Huayu, Xiao, I came here to discuss the burial matter with you. It's a hot day and it's not easy for the body to be buried for a long time. Everyone wants to bury it as soon as possible, what do you think? Gu Huayu thought for a while and said, I'm sorry for my grandfather's hasty burial. Also, Anayang and the others can't see my grandfather off for the last time. Gu Chengdong said, there is nothing we can do about it. The weather is too hot and the body cannot be placed there. Gu Huayu said, put my grandfather's body in the ice coffin. Where can I find an ice coffin on a hot day? Gu Huayu asked, is there any selling stone in town? Gu Chengdong replied, there is not one in the town, but there is one in the county. Gu Huayu said, brother, go and buy more. Gu Difang asked, Xiao, what are you doing buying saltpeter? That thing is not cheap. Gu Huayu said, saltpeter can be used to make ice. My grandfather has worked hard all his life. Let's invite the masters from Jinming Temple to perform some rituals for my grandfather. Gu Dichang not only hopes that his father will be buried with dignity, but also hopes that Wan and others can catch up to see his father off. Xiao is right, do as Xiao said. Gu Difang and Gu Dihe are both very filial people, so they naturally agree with it. The next day, the Gu family invited a master from Jinming Temple to perform rituals for Gu Huaidong, and the burial date was scheduled for August 16. Wan and others returned to Shangtai village on the 10th day of August to see off Gu Huaidong for the last time. After the family buried Gu Huaidong, they sat together to discuss matters of filial piety. Gu Dichang and the Wan family stayed to observe their filial piety. Gu Chennan and his son, Gu Chenglin's family of 4, Gu Chengwan and Sui brother returned to Beijing with Gu Huayu. On the way back to Beijing, we encountered a steady autumn rain, which made the carriage go slowly. It was not until mid-October that the carriages and horses entered the capital. Gu Chengwan opened the curtain of the car between Gu Chennan and Chu Yi, and said to Chu Yi, on the first day of the new year, I went to talk to my sister-in-law. On the first day of the month, he sat up straight from Gu Chennan's arms and asked, what's wrong? My sister-in-law is unhappy again. Gu Chennan asked, Xiao still doesn't like to talk. Gu Chengwan nodded, yes, I am sitting alone in a daze, not knowing what I am thinking. Chushi stood up and said, Dad, let's go and have a look on the first day of Chuyi. Gu Chennan said, go and persuade my sister-in-law to be more open-minded. On the first day of the new year, Gu Huayu walked to the carriage, stretched out her hand and patted the window. Gu Huayu poked her head out, saw Chuyi, and asked, why are you here? On the first day of the new year, Qing Yu asked him to carry him into the carriage, entered the carriage, and said to Gu Huayu, second aunt asked me to come here. She said that she was unhappy again and asked me to come and talk to her. Dad asked me to persuade her, let my sister-in-law be more open-minded. Gu Huayu asked, then how are you going to persuade me? As soon as Gu Huayu finished her words, King Yu's voice sounded as the brakes came on, Princess, be careful, there is an assassin. Gu Huayu hugged Chuyi and said, don't be afraid, my sister-in-law is here. On the first day of the month, he was curious and wanted to open the curtains and look out, but Gu Huayu stopped him. Don't move. Gu Huayu listened carefully to the movements outside. No matter how hard she concentrated, the sounds she could hear were very limited. Her hearing was gradually returning to normal. King Yu said, Princess, Mi Chen sent secret guards to follow us. They have withdrawn. Do we want to pursue them? Gu Huayu shook her head, don't chase, we are taking a big family with us, and we were careful to fall into the opponent's trick of diverting the tiger away from the mountain, so we asked everyone to speed up their journey and try to reach the capital before Guancheng Gate. The secret guard leaned outside and said, Princess, the other party left a note. A note. King Yu reached out and took the note and handed it into the carriage. Gu Huayu took it and opened it and looked at it. She saw the note saying, stay away from Luzikin, otherwise, you will be killed. The handwriting is strong and vigorous, and it should be written by a man. Who is this person? Gu Huayu frowned slightly, who was threatening her because of Luzikin. She was in a hurry these days when she left the capital and couldn't say goodbye to him. She had to ask Mi Chen to send someone to tell him. He wouldn't be angry, right? Is he okay? King Yu asked, Princess, what did the other party say? Gu Huayu put the note away and said, let me stay away from Mr. Lulu. Princess, do you know what it is? King Yu asked. Gu Huayu replied, I don't know, second brother, third brother, are they okay? King Yu replied, the other party's target is our car, and they have not attacked other cars. The second master and the others are fine. That's good, let's speed up everyone, let's go back to the city as soon as possible, Gu Huayu ordered. Okay, I'll go and tell you this, little one. End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 277. Chapter 277, only save those who are destined. Gu Huayu turned around and saw Chuyi looking at her. She was slightly startled and asked, are you afraid? Chuyi shook his head and asked, don't be afraid. Sister-in-law, why do the bad guys want you to stay away from Master Lulu? Who is Master Lulu? Gu Huayu said, Master Lulu is my sister-in-law's good friend. Then why does the bad guy want my sister-in-law to stay away from Mr. Lulu? The bad guys don't want my sister-in-law to be friends with Mr. Lulu. Will my sister-in-law listen to bad people? Gu Huayu asked, if I were my sister-in-law in the first year of junior high school, would I listen to bad people? Chushi thought for a while, shook his head and said, no. Gu Huayu asked, why? What if you don't listen to the bad people and the bad people come to trouble you? Chui replied, if a bad person dares to cause trouble, I will fight with him. But if I listen to the bad person, my good friend will be sad. Gu Huayu raised her hand and rubbed Chuyi's head, and said with a smile, well, that makes sense. I will listen to you. On the first day of the new year, I chatted with Gu Huayu for a while. When I saw Gu Huayu yawning, I stood up and left. Gu Huayu said, on the first day of the new year, what happened today is our secret. Don't tell others, okay? Chuzi raised his head and asked, can't Dad tell me too? Gu Huayu nodded, your father will be worried if he finds out. My sister-in-law doesn't want Dad to worry, right? Gu Huayu smiled and nodded. Chuyi raised 3 fingers of his right hand and promised, don't worry, sister, what happened today is a secret between Chuyi and my sister-in-law. I have a rest, Chuyi has gone back. Gu Huayu asked King Yu to send Chuyi to Gu Jinnan's car. After leaving on the first day of the new year, Gu Huayu fell into thinking again. Who is the other person? Why should she be prevented from dating Luzikin? Luzikin received the letter and took Rugjuan to the post office 30 miles away. When Qingyu saw Luzikin, he was about to say hello, but Luzikin put his hand to his mouth to signal him to be silent. Qingyu opened his eyes wide and swallowed back the words that came to his lips. Luzikin gestured to Qingyu to slow down the car. After Qingyu understood, he followed the instructions. Luzikin jumped into Gu Huayu's car while the car slowed down. Gu Huayu leaned against the car and was lost in thought, unaware of what was happening outside the car. She didn't open her eyes until a familiar breath hit her face. Opening my eyes, I saw a handsome face looking at me with a smile. I was so surprised that I opened my eyes wide and looked at him stupidly. Luzikin didn't say anything, and looked at Gu Huayu with tenderness in his eyes. He saw accident, surprise, and more of longing in Gu Huayu's eyes for a moment. After a long while, Luzikin raised his hand and waved it in front of Gu Huayu's eyes, sat next to her, tilted his head and looked at Gu Huayu and said softly, "What's wrong? Are you stupid? You have lost a lot of weight." Gu Huayu threw herself into Luzikin's arms, buried her head in his chest, took a few deep breaths, until the familiar smell filled her chest, and then replied, "It's not stupid, I miss you. Qingjian, my grandfather is gone, I will take him to live in the capital for a few years and honor his old man. Qingjian, my grandfather will be gone before I can honor him. I am so sad." Luzikin hugged Gu Huayu and comforted him in a gentle voice, "I know, you asked Gu Qinglin to go back to pick up his old man. Xiao, don't be sad, the old man must know your thoughts, and he must be very pleased." After hearing Luzikin's words, Gu Huayu's inner self-blame became much lighter. He put his arms around Luzikin and said, "Qingjian, I miss you." Luzikin hugged Gu Huayu tightly, lowered his head and kissed Gu Huayu's hair, and whispered, "I miss you too, very much." Gu Huayu raised her head and looked at Luzikin. Luzikin lowered his head and their lips touched. They both trembled slightly at the same time, feeling overwhelming thoughts. Gu Huayu nestled in Luzikin's arms, playing with the jade pendant he was carrying, and asked, "Qingjian, how do you know that I am returning to Beijing today?" Luzikin looked down at her, "What do you think? You live in my heart, how can I not know?" Gu Huayu suddenly thought of something and said tentatively, "I know, Chang'an restaurant, you know it when I set off from Xishan." Luzikin nodded, "Yes, when you set out from Xishan, shopkeeper Shen handed you a letter. Not only the Chang'an restaurant in Xishan, but also the Chang'an restaurants along the way that you passed by on your way back will deliver the letter. Calculate the itinerary, it should arrive today." Gu Huayu thought about whether to tell Luzikin about meeting the assassin. "Little guy, what are you thinking about?" Luzikin asked, seeing Gu Huayu's hesitant expression. Gu Huayu met Luzikin's gaze, hesitated, and took out the note. "Qingjian, look at this." After Luzikin took the note and read it, his face darkened and he asked, "Who gave it to you?" Gu Huayu said, "More than half an hour ago, I met an assassin when passing by Huashikan. The assassin left it behind. The reason why Huashikan got its name is because there is no water source here and there is a drought 9 times out of 10 years, making it difficult to grow crops. Therefore, there are no homes within a radius of more than 10 miles. Hearing that he met an assassin, Luzikin said nervously, "Assassinated? Are you injured? Are everyone else okay?" Gu Huayu shook her head, "No, the other party's target is me. They probably wanted to give me some warning and did not attack anyone else. The other party not only knows my itinerary, but also knows which car I am driving." This incident made Gu Huayu very frustrated. The other person knew her very well, but she didn't know who the other person was. This feeling made Gu Huayu very uneasy. Luzikin read the note again and then put it away. "Let me check this matter." Gu Huayu said, "Let's check it out together." Luzikin thought for a while, nodded and said, "Okay." Gu Huayu asked, "How are you these days?" Luzikin nodded, it went smoothly. After returning from Qingcheng Temple, I cancelled all the banquets and concentrated on studying at home. Luzikin didn't say anything about secretly searching for Wei Ruo. Still living in the British government. Luzikin nodded, yes, my father will return to Beijing next month to report on his work. My father is back, and my mother and I don't live in the British government's residence. It's hard for the British government to explain to my father. By the way, the wedding date of King Xian and Miss Wang San is set for the 26th of this month. Gu Huayu didn't care about irrelevant people. Oh, she said. Just as she was about to change the subject, Rugjuan's voice came from outside the car, Sir, it seems that there is Ruhin ahead. Something may have happened. Ruhin is in a hurry. Gu Huayu immediately sat up straight and raised her hands to smooth her hair. Sir, something happened before Gu Huayu had finished arranging her hair. Rumo had already urged her horse to come forward. Elvizikin lifted the curtain and asked, what happened? Ru Yan leaned over and said, the madam and the second lady had a dispute in the garden, and they started fighting. The second lady pushed the madam down, and the madam put her head on the stone after falling to the ground. There was a lot of blood, and now the madam is unconscious. When Gu Huayu heard this, she put her head on the stone and her heart sank. Without waiting for Luzikin to speak, she ordered, Ruhin, go to Minjiao Pavilion on Yongchun Road and send my medical box to the British government. Qinjian, madam is injured, it's going to be dangerous in the end, let's ride back. Okay. I understand, little one. After hearing this, Ru Jin turned his horse's head and drove back. Gu Huayu got off the car and climbed onto Luzikin's horse. Luzikin followed Gu Huayu and got out of the car. Xinchi got off his horse and gave his horse to Luzikin. Gu Huayu said to Rugjuan, you go in front, we will follow behind you. Okay. I understand, little one. After saying that, Rugjuan clamped his legs and moved forward. Seeing Luzikin mount his horse, Gu Huayu urged the horse to chase Rugjuan. Qinjian, follow up. Don't worry, as long as Mrs is breathing, I will definitely rescue her. Luzikin urged his horse and replied, as long as you are here, I won't worry. You can concentrate on riding. The three of them ran wildly and soon entered the city gate. Rugjuan shouted at people to get out of the way and whipped the horse at the same time. Gu Huayu followed closely behind Rugjuan, and Luzikin's horse followed Gu Huayu's horse. Pedestrians on the road heard Rugjuan's shouting and rushed to the side to avoid it. As they approached the British Duke's mansion, Luzikin saw the side door open and said to Rugjuan, Rugjuan, ride in and get off your horse at the Chihuahua gate. Young man, I understand. The three of them entered the British mansion through the side door. Gu Huayu followed Rugjuan to the Chihuahua gate, dismounted, and a servant immediately came over to take the reins. Luzikin said, Xiao, you follow me. Rugjuan, when you get to Linglong Garden, send out all the unimportant people. Gu Huayu followed Luzikin and hurried to Linglong Garden where Mrs lived. Along the way, when the servants saw Luzikin, they bowed their heads and bowed their knees to him. At this time, the corridor of Linglong Garden was full of people. Sixth Master is here, get out of the way, Rugjuan shouted as he walked. Hearing that Luzikin was coming, the crowd automatically made way for them. Gu Huayu entered the house and saw Mrs Jin, Mrs Jian, Yamingjian and the British Duke all there. Mrs Jin raised her head and saw Luzikin. She stopped holding the beads in her hand and stood up, Zikin. Mrs Jin saw Gu Huayu behind Luzikin again and wanted to say hello. Luzikin asked, where is mother? Yamingjian said, in the inner room, Dr. who came over to treat my aunt. Luzikin said, I'll go in and take a look. After saying that, Luzikin took Gu Huayu to the inner room. The British Duke saw Luzikin leading Gu Huayu into the back room and said, Zikin, Dr. who is treating your mother-in-law. It is not appropriate to bring in irrelevant people to disturb her at this time. Luzikin glanced at the British Duke and said to Gu Huayu, Xiao, you go in first. Gu Huayu nodded in agreement and walked past the British Duke. The British Duke looked at Luzikin, you. My lord, you'd better pray that my mother is okay, otherwise, I will let the British government bury her with her. After Luzikin finished speaking, he stopped looking at the British gentleman and turned around to go to the inner room. The British Duke watched Luzikin push the door open and close it again, unable to say a word. The British Duke knew in his heart that what Luzikin just said was not just words. He felt the coldness in Luzikin's eyes. Sister Yu, what happened today was just an accident. Look at Zikin. Mrs. Jean had already sat back and looked down at the Buddhist beads in her hand. Hearing the British father-in-law speaking to her, Mrs. Jean still closed her eyes slightly, holding the prayer beads in her hand, and said calmly, now that things have happened, what's the use of talking about this? Let me pray that Sister Shan is fine. The British Duke wanted to say a few words to Mrs. Jean, but Mrs. Jean didn't answer his words at all, so she had to sit back angrily. Gu Huayu entered the room. Ruhi turned around and saw her, and felt happy. Master, is the princess? Before he could say the word Fu, he thought of the presence of Dr. and immediately changed his name to Princess. Physician who was cleaning Mrs. wound. He raised his head and glanced at Gu Huayu, then lowered his head and continued his work. Gu Huayu took a step forward and asked, how is Mrs. After sniffing her nose, there was a faint fishy smell in the room. Ruhi replied, back to the princess. Physician who raised his head and looked at Gu Huayu, I am still treating Madam Ye. The princess should choose another time to visit Madam. Gu Huayu nodded and said, yes, I understand. Gu Huayu responded, and she took a step forward. The closer she got to Mrs. the stronger the fishy smell became. Gu Huayu frowned slightly and looked at Mrs. wound. Physician who raised his head again and said with a bit of displeasure, Princess, you have blocked my light. Gu Huayu ignored Dr. Stared at the wound on Mrs. forehead and asked, why doesn't the bleeding stop? Ruhi replied, go back to the princess, the bleeding cannot be stopped. Luzikin opened the door and walked in. Hearing Ruhi's words, he hurried over and asked, how are you, Xiao? Gu Huayu stretched out her hand to open Mrs. eyes, then looked at Mrs. face and hands, and then said, Madam shows signs of poisoning. The coagulation factors in her body are damaged and the bleeding cannot be stopped. What should we do? Luzikin asked anxiously. Gu Huayu said, go and see, has Jin brought the medical kit? Okay, Luzikin responded, turned around and walked out. Before he could reach the door, Jin pushed the door open and came in panting, Princess, the medical kit is here. Ruhi hurriedly walked over, took the medical box and put it on the low table beside the bed. Princess, is there any way to stop the bleeding? Gu Huayu ordered, open the medical box, take a test tube to get some blood, and then turn around to see what kind of poison my wife has been exposed to. As Ji followed his words, Gu Huayu raised his hand to check Madame Ye's pulse. After a moment, he stood up and took out a pill from the medical box and fed it to Madame Ye. Physician who looked at Gu Huayu in shock, does the princess understand medicine? No, a little bit. Physician who changed his previous disgusting attitude and asked humbly, may I ask the princess, how did the princess know that my wife was poisoned? Gu Huayu said truthfully, there is a fishy smell in the house, Madame's lips and nail beds are white, and the skin and sclera are yellow. Physician who asked curiously, what is the skin and sclera? Gu Huayu realized that she had made a mistake and immediately explained, it's the skin on the face and the white eyes. Physician who then asked, does the princess know what kind of poison the lady has been exposed to? Gu Huayu said, to know the general category and the specific poison, you need to look carefully to know. Physician who bowed and said, the princess has great medical skills, I admire her. Gu Huayu blessed her body and said, I don't want others to know that I understand medicine, so I asked Dr. Hu to help me. Physician Hu was puzzled and said, treating diseases and saving people is a matter of immeasurable merit. This is also a good opportunity for the princess to become famous. Why doesn't the princess know about her talents? Gu Huayu didn't want to explain too much, so she just said, I only save people who are destined, and I ask Dr. Hu to understand. End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the Lucky Girl from a Farm Family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 278. Chapter 278 Turn your elbows inward. Gu Huayu took out the silver needle and prepared to give Mrsye the needle, and said, You need to stay away, I am going to give Mrsye the needle. Physician Hu saw the silver needle in Gu Huayu's hand and suddenly remembered that Lu Ziqin was poisoned that day. When he came over for treatment, Lu Ziqin also had the same set of needles inserted into his body. Physician Hu suddenly realized that Gu Huayu was the master in Ruhi's mouth. The word master that Ruhi blurted out just now was because he wanted to call Master Gu Huayu, but just because he was there, Ruhi suddenly changed his words. Could it be that Gu Huayu is the well-traveled doctor mentioned by Lu Ziqin? Thinking of this, Doctor Hu felt refreshed again. If it is really what I think, then there will be more talents than anyone else. Lu Ziqin said to Dr. Hu, Mr. Hu, please come this way. Physician Hu came to his senses, leaned forward and said, Okay. Ruhi asked, Princess, do you need someone to come in and help? Gu Huayu shook her head and replied, No need. Lu Ziqin, Imperial Physician Hu, and Ruhi walked to the other side of the screen, leaving Gu Huayu alone by the bed. Gu Huayu first untied Mrsye's clothes and then started to apply the acupuncture. When Gu Huayu saw Mrsye's smooth and tight belly, her hands couldn't help but paused, and she suddenly understood what poison Mrsye had received. Gu Huayu continued to apply acupuncture, treated Mrsye's wound, and checked her pulse before getting up and walking to the screen. When Lu Ziqin saw her coming, he poured her a cup of tea and said, Thank you for your hard work, Xiao. Let's drink some water first. After running back in a hurry and not taking a break until now, Gu Huayu was indeed very thirsty. Taking the teacup, Gu Huayu drank a few sips, feeling much better, and then put the cup back on the table. Lu Ziqin looked at Gu Huayu who was so thirsty and asked apologetically, Do you want more? Gu Huayu shook her head and said, No need. Physician Hu glanced at the screen and asked, The princess's medical skills are very good, who can I learn from? Gu Huayu said calmly, My master is a low-key person and doesn't let me talk to others. Physician Hu saw that Gu Huayu was unwilling to say more, so he couldn't ask any more questions. He just said, The young man wants to ask the princess something. Gu Huayu saw that Lu Ziqin treated Dr. Hu with respect, and her attitude towards him became more polite. What's the matter? Mr. Hu, please tell me. Physician Hu asked, Can I give the little old man one of the pills that the princess gave the emperor for insomnia last time? Gu Huayu looked at Dr. Hu in confusion, What kind of elixir? I never gave the emperor any elixir. Physician Hu turned to look at Lu Ziqin, sixth master. Seeing that Dr. Hu had guessed it, Lu Ziqin no longer hid it from him, and said to Gu Huayu, It's the box of pills I asked you for a few years ago. I asked for it for the emperor. In Gu Huayu's memory, Lu Ziqin only asked for elixirs once. Oh, I know, I happen to have a few of that kind of elixir in my medical box. I'll go get it for Mr. Hu. With that said, Gu Huayu turned around and went to the bedside, took out a box of pills from the lower layer of the medical box and handed it to Dr. Hu. Physician Hu took the elixir and thanked him profusely. Lu Ziqin glanced at the screen and asked worriedly, Xiao, when will mother wake up? Gu Huayu shook her head and said, It's not clear yet. I just took my wife's pulse again. After she took the elixir, her pulse was stronger than before, but still very weak. I would like to ask Dr. Hu to prescribe a prescription for Madam's recovery. Luzikin bowed to Dr. Hu and said, Mr. Hu, you are busy. Physician Hu looked at Gu Huayu with some confusion. Why did the princess ask the young old man to prescribe the prescription? Gu Huayu smiled and said bluntly, when Dr. Hu comes, he always has to do something, right? She was given elixirs directly for her health care. Of course, this cannot be said. Physician Hu thought that Gu Huayu was trying to deceive others, so he nodded in agreement. Okay, I'll give you the prescription. Lvizikin asked, Xiao, can mother move like this? Gu Huayu looked at Luzikin and asked, does Qinjian want to take Mrs. back to the Qingqiu palace? Lvizikin nodded. Gu Huayu shook her head and said, it's best not to. First of all, Madam is hurting her head. It's best not to move until she wakes up. Secondly, Madam is very weak now. Let her take care of herself for a few days until she recovers better before going back late. Physician Hu wanted to go back to study the elixir in a hurry, so he said, the princess and Dr. G are here, so I don't need to stay longer. Master Lu can go with me to prescribe the prescription. Princess, I say goodbye to you today, and I will come to ask for advice from the princess another day. Gu Huayu guessed that Dr. Hu had seen the cause of Mrs. illness, and leaned forward and said, it's out of the question to ask for advice. Mr. Hu is too polite. Mr. Hu is welcome to visit at any time. Luzikin led Dr. Hu out of the house. When people outside saw Luzikin and Dr. Hu coming out, they came over to greet them. The British Duke asked, Mr. Hu, how is Mr. Yet? Physician Hu leaned forward and said, the bleeding has stopped and the wound has been treated. Now I will prescribe a prescription for my wife to nurse her back to health. My wife is extremely weak. It is best not to disturb her and let her rest. After saying that, Dr. Hu followed Luzikin to the study next door. Ms. Jean was relieved in her heart, and she said to the British government with a straight face, I'm waiting for the British government to give me an explanation for today's matter. Knowing that Yeshan's life was safe, the British Duke was relieved. However, after listening to Ms. Jean's words, the British Duke had a headache again. He explained with a smile, Sister you have always been the most reasonable and considerate person, satisfactory. Today's incident was really just an accident. Sister Shan was Li's sister-in-law. Even if she borrowed Li's courage, she would not dare to attack Sister Shan. Li did not do it intentionally, she just made a mistake and it was an unintentional mistake. Sister I will ask Ms. Li to come over and apologize to you now. Look back, wait until Sister Shan wakes up, and then ask her to apologize to Sister Shan and admit her mistake. What do you think? Not so good. Before Ms. Jean could reply, Luzikin stood at the door of the study and said. After Luzikin finished speaking, he turned around and said, Ruhin, send Dr. Hu to you, and grab the medicine by the way. Physician Hu didn't want to get involved in other people's family affairs, so he hurriedly bowed and left. After Dr. Hu left, the British Duke turned to Luzikin and persuaded him, Zikin, everything is going well at home. What's the use of making noise? Luzikin did not give the British Duke any face, and said calmly, the Duke should tell the second lady this. Lvizikin did not give the British Duke face in front of the people in Qingqiu Palace, which made the British Duke very embarrassed. Then what are you going to do? The British Duke's face darkened, full of displeasure. The atmosphere in the room was a bit tense, and the servants stood by the side with their heads bowed, not daring to express their anger. Ms. Jean was still taking care of the Buddhist beads in her hand and had no intention of persuading her. Luzikin walked into the house and said, I don't want to do anything. I'm not a mother, and I can't make decisions for my mother. What will happen today will be whatever she says when mother wakes up. My mother said she would not pursue the matter, so I said nothing about it. If the mother says she won't spare the second lady, then the second lady will also do what the mother suffered today. Mrs. Jean nodded and said, what Zikin said makes sense. Just do what Zikin said. Wait until Sister Shan wakes up and see what she says. The British Duke was dissatisfied with Mrs. Jean's attitude and said patiently, Sister you are already several decades old. You should know how to make your family and everything prosper. A family should be considerate of each other. The British Duke's words revealed his dissatisfaction with Mrs. Jean. When Mrs. Jean heard this, she was unhappy and said, My lord, the injured one lying on the bed is our Sister Shan. I'm sorry or not, it's up to Sister Shan to say. Luzikin didn't want his grandmother to be angry with the British father. Before the British public spoke, Luzikin spoke first, Grandma, Aunt, Sister Jin, Mother is still in a coma and needs to rest. You go back today and wait until Mother wakes up, I will send my mother back to Chinquo Palace. After hearing what Luzikin said, the British Duke immediately jumped to his feet and said, Zikin, everyone said that what happened today was an accident. I have already punished Mr. Li by being grounded in Yujingyuan for 10 days. What else do you want? Besides, this matter is a family matter of the British government. What is going on when people from the Chinquo government are gesticulating here? After hearing what the British Duke said, Mrs. Jean stood up and said, My lord, I don't like hearing what you say. Why do people from the Chinquo Palace dictate things here? Yashan is the daughter of my Duke Chinquo. She was bullied by her husband's family. Can't the people of Duke Chinquo ask a question? What's the point? The British Duke knew he had made a mistake, but he couldn't help but apologize, Sister you, whose family hasn't had some quarrels. It's normal for sisters-in-law to have some disputes. Are you so serious? Mr. Chin sneered and said, Yashan was born in my 10-month pregnancy and raised with all kinds of hardships. She was bullied to the point of unconsciousness. My heart is bleeding. Do you still blame me for being too serious? Tell me, whose sister-in-law got into a quarrel in the capital and killed someone? Sister Shan is still unconscious. Are you speaking human language? Luzikin stepped forward to support Mrs. Jean and advised, Grandma, calm down, there is no need to reason with unreasonable people. There is Zikin on the mother's side. If the mother is wronged, Zikin will seek justice for her. You and your aunt and others go back first. When his mother woke up, Zikin sent her back. Mrs. Jean gave the British father a fierce look and said to Mrs. Jean and Yemingjin, let's go back first. Luzikin sent Mrs. Jean and others to the second gate, watched them get in the car and leave, then turned around and walked back. When they met the British Duke and Du Bin, the British Duke stopped when he saw Luzikin, pointed at him and cursed, You unfilial son, do you remember that you are a descendant of the British Duke? Your surname is Lu. With your elbows out like this a kid. Luzikin put his hands behind his back and said, The British Lord is wrong, my elbows are always facing in. Whoever treats me as a relative and treats me well will be the one to whom I will tilt my elbow. I am an unfilial son in your eyes, but I am a good grandson in my grandmother's eyes. After saying that, Luzikin walked away. Bing Britain gasped in anger and watched Luzikin clenching his back teeth. He said bitterly, This unworthy man. I wish I could strangle him to death. Luzikin stopped and turned to look at the British Duke. I have always known that the British Duke wants to strangle me. Isn't it that what annoys Mr. Guo the most right now is that he wants to strangle me to death, but he can't? The wise king and his empress want me to sacrifice my life for them, but you can't explain it to them until you strangle me to death. Moreover, if you strangle me to death, Duke Chinquo will disobey me and make trouble in front of the emperor, who will settle the score with you. So, you have to endure it? Seeing that the British Duke was trembling with anger, Du Bin advised him, Sixth Master, the Duke of Guo is also doing this family a favor, so please say less. Lvizikin looked at Du Bin, turned around and left. The British Duke looked at Luzikin's back and said, "How did he become like this?" Dubin sighed and said, 3 feet of ice will not last in a day. Master Lu is heartbroken and he is angry again today, so he said such angry words. When the eldest lady wakes up, Master Liu's anger has subsided. Maybe it will be good. The British Duke sighed and said, "Let's go back first." Luzikin returned to the room, looked at Aunt Yao's side, and asked, "What happened today? How did mother get involved with the second lady?" Grandma Yao bent her knees and said, "When Madam's accident happened, I went to the kitchen and was not around. I don't know the specific situation." Furong stepped forward and bent her knees, "Back to Mr. Lu, at that time my servant and Ying Luo were with my wife." Luzikin saw that Furong's face was bruised and purple, and said, "Tell me what happened in the morning." Furong said, "After breakfast today, my wife suddenly wanted to go to the Juyuan to see the chrysanthemums, so she took her slave and Ying Luo to the Juyuan. We walked to the rockery in the garden. My wife saw that the hibiscus flowers on the rockery were blooming well, so she stopped and took a look. Soon, the second lady and the second grandma came to the rockery. The madam is in the Furong garden with her servants. The second madam and the second grandma have not seen us. The second wife and the second wife were chatting about the wife. The second wife asked the second wife why the wife stayed away from home all year round and lived in the Chinquo palace. The second lady smiled maliciously, and then said something strange and sinister, "What would a man do in the house if he was not at home? It's so nice to live outside, free and easy to do anything." After hearing what the second lady said, the madam was so angry that she rushed out of the garden, stopped the second lady and the second grandmother, and asked them to argue. The madam had a quarrel with the second madam and the others. The second husband pointed at the madam and scolded her. The madam raised her hand to block the second madam's hand, and a fight broke out. When the second lady pushed the wife, she lost her footing and fell down. When the wife fell, she hit her head on a stone and fainted. After hearing this, Luzikin nodded and said, "I know, let's go down. Sunruhi needs some plaster to apply on the wounds on his body." Hibiscus bowed her knees and thanked her. Luzikin said to Aunt Yao, "When Ruhi comes back from grabbing the medicine, I will have someone boil the medicine for my mother." Mama Yao bent her knees and responded. Luzikin turned around and entered the back room, where he saw Gu Huayu cleaning the silver needles. So he asked, "How is it?" Gu Huayu raised her head, looked at Luzikin, and said, "This poison has been in Madam's body for many years, and it cannot be completely removed in one go. It will take several more injections and some elixirs to remove it completely." Luzikin asked, "Is the poison my mother was poisoned the same as the poison I was poisoned back then?" Gu Huayu shook her head and said, "No, what you won was the 7-star begonia, but what Madam won was not." End of this chapter. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. The Rebirth of Space, the lucky girl from a farm family. Author, he would fire every. Chapter 279. Chapter 279 Reluctance. Luzikin looked at Gu Huayu nervously and asked, "What kind of poison is in my mother?" Gu Huayu lowered her head and placed the silver needle, paused her hand slightly, and said hesitantly, "I'm not sure yet, let me think about it again. Don't worry, I gave my wife Beidou Qing, plus acupuncture to detoxify her. The poison in her body can be detoxified." Gu Huayu was in a panic. Gu Huayu kept telling herself that she was a doctor and respecting the patient's privacy was her professional quality. But this is related to Luzikin's life experience. What should she do? Gu Huayu took a deep breath to calm down her mind. This matter is too big, and it is not suitable to talk about it at this time, place, and situation. She wanted to wait for Mrs. Ye to wake up and listen to Mrs. Ye's explanation first. No matter who Lu Zikin is, he is the person she recognizes. Therefore, she must not be impulsive. Giving herself time to sort out her thoughts also gave Zikin time to buffer. Lu Zikin saw Gu Huayu's uneasy expression, and thought that Gu Huayu was guilty for not finding out the source of the poison, and comforted him, "Don't be anxious, take your time. I know." Gu Huayu put away the silver needle, took out a box of pills and handed them to Lu Zikin, saying, "Put this away, one in the morning and one in the evening. Remember to take it for Madam. I'll go back first and come back tomorrow to give Madam the acupuncture." Lu Zikin took the elixir, handed it to Ruhi, and said, "I'll take you back." Gu Huayu shook her head, "No, Madam is not awake yet, and she may wake up at any time. Just stay and take care of Madam, and let Rugjuan take me back." Lu Zikin was worried about Mrsya, thought for a moment and said, "Then I'll deliver it to the door of the house." "Good." Lu Zikin and Gu Huayu walked out side by side and met Lu Zixun, who was returning home. "Hey, the princess has returned to Beijing, when did she come back?" Gu Huayu rolled her eyes at Lu Zixun and said to Lu Zikin, "Brother Zikin, just send him here. I'll go back." Lu Zikin said, "I'll take you to the gate, let's go." From beginning to end, Lu Zikin never gave Lu Zixun a look. Lu Zixun was despised by the two of them, and angrily shouted at Lu Zikin, "Old Lu, please remember it for me." Gu Huayu turned around and looked over. Lu Zikin raised his hand and turned Gu Huayu's head forward and said, "Ignore the irrelevant people." Gu Huayu responded obediently, "Okay." The two of them sang in unison, leaving Lu Zixun, who was turning green with anger, behind. Lv Zixun looked at the two people's backs and shouted, "Old Lu, remember this for me, I will make your death ugly." Gu Huayu raised her voice and replied, "Lu Zixun, remember this for me. If you dare to touch Brother Zikin, I will make you regret it." Lu Zikin turned his head and looked at Gu Huayu, "Don't pay attention to him." Gu Huayu pouted and said, "If he dares to do you harm, I will make him regret it. I am the only one who can bully my people." Lu Zikin asked with a smile on his face, "Are you willing to bully me?" Gu Huayu turned her head and looked at Lu Zikin, "That's what I said, of course I can't let it go." Lv Zikin rubbed Gu Huayu's head with satisfaction, "That's pretty much it." Next, neither of them spoke, and walked side by side to the gate. Lu Zikin helped Gu Huayu get into the car, watched the carriage go away, and then turned around and went back home. At Rong'an Hall, Mrs. Yang told Grandma Wang, "Let the kitchen make crispy duck, glutinous pork ribs, 8 treasure rice, and 60 meatballs." Grandma Wang reminded, "Old Madam, there are already a lot of dishes." Old Madam Yang waved her hand to interrupt Grandma Wang, "I know, I am happy today, so I will add a few dishes to celebrate. By the way, let the kitchen make 5 portions. We will send 1 portion to the Duke, the second Madam, the Grand Master, and the second Master here." Grandma Wang bent her knees and said, "Old slave, go right now. Just let people do these little things, you don't have to do it yourself. I've made arrangements to come over and talk to me." Grandma Wang bent her knees to thank her, turned around to do the instructions, and then returned to Mrs. Yang. Mrs. Yang pointed to the brocade stool beside her and motioned for her to sit down. Grandma Wang bowed and thanked her and sat down. Old Madam Yang looked at the servants standing by and said with disgust, "You guys go down, you really don't have any discernment at all." The maid and her mother-in-law bent their knees in response, turned around and left the house. Mrs. Yang was leaning on the beauty couch. Grandma Wang picked up the jade ruyi and beat Mrs. Yang's legs gently. Old Mrs. Yang said cheerfully to Grandma Wang, "I am happy today." Grandma Wang responded with a smile, "I know this. Let people keep an eye on you, I'll wait for the funeral report at Linglong Garden." "Don't worry, old lady, I asked Shuer to lead someone to keep an eye on her." Mrs. Yang sat up, looked at Grandma Wang doubtfully, and said, Since the medicine is effective, how did she give birth to that evil obstacle? Grandma Wang looked at Mrs. Yang. Isn't the sixth master born to Mrs. Yang? That's not possible. Mr. Liu's nose and eyes look very much like Madam's. How could he not be born to Madam? Mrs. Yang thought about it and leaned back on the beauty's bed. There are exceptions to everything. The fact that it can give birth to a sinister child may be an exception. The sinister has been weak since he was a child, which may be related to this. Grandma Wang nodded and agreed with Mrs. Yang's words. Old Madam, Shuer is back, the servant reported at the door. Let her in. Mrs. Yang turned over and sat up, looked at Shuer with gleaming eyes, and asked anxiously, how is Linglong Garden? Did the die? Shuer shook her head, back to the old lady, the eldest lady has not yet died. Doctor who treated the eldest lady's wound and prescribed a prescription. Mr. Liu asked, are you Yan to get the medicine? Prescribed? That is not dead? Is he alive? Seeing the disappointment in Mrs. Yang's words, Shuer didn't dare to look at Mrs. Yang anymore. She lowered her head and replied, Madam is not dead, but she is not awake yet. Mrs. Yang looked at Grandma Wang and said, didn't you say that if you get poisonous, you will definitely die? Can Dr. Hu cure it? It's possible. I heard that Dr. Hu's medical skills are among the best in the Taiyuan hospital, even better than Dr. Su. The light in Mrs. Yang's eyes dimmed and she asked in a deep voice, what other letters have you found? Shuer raised her head and glanced at Mrs. Yang, then immediately lowered her head and said, the sixth master and the Duke of Guo had a quarrel. What's going on? Are you having a quarrel with the old man? Mrs. Yang became energetic again and her voice became louder. Seeing that Mrs. Yang was in high spirits, Shuer looked up at Mrs. Yang and repeated what she saw and heard. Mrs. Yang stood up in a good mood and said, Ms. Li has done a good job today. Let's go over and see her. Mrs. Yang fell asleep for 2 days and woke up on the morning of the third day. When she woke up, Gu Huayu was tightening her needles. Gu Huayu saw Mrs. Yang opening her eyes, smiled at her and said, Madam, are you awake? Yan Ran, Mrs. Yang said in surprise. Gu Huayu nodded towards her, it's me. Madam, don't move, I'm tightening the needles. After hearing what Gu Huayu said, Mrs. Yang put away the idea of getting up and lay down looking at Gu Huayu. When did Yan Ran return to Beijing? Gu Huayu replied while retracting the needle, the lady came back the day she fainted. Lu Zikin's voice sounded from the other side of the screen, Mother, it was Xiao who saved you. Yan Ran, thank you. Gu Huayu smiled and said, Madam, you're too polite. It's just a coincidence. Lu Zikin's voice sounded again, Mom, Xiao is our family's great benefactor. He saved my life, and this time he saved my mother's life. Watching Lu Zikin spare no effort to ask for credit from Mrs. Yang. Gu Huayu turned to Lu Zikin on the other side of the screen and said, Qinjian, shut up. Mrs. Yang smiled and said, Zikin is right, Yan Ran is a great benefactor to our family. Gu Huayu is most afraid of others praising her, and is too embarrassed to know how to respond. I could only giggle and quickly put away the silver needle, help Mrs. Yang tidy up her clothes, and then checked her pulse. Madam's pulse is stable, there is no serious problem. I will help Mrs. Yang up. Okay, Mrs. Yang sat up with the help of Gu Huayu's hand. How long have I slept? Lu Zikin came over and said, not long ago, I just slept for 3 days. Slept for 3 days, so long. Mother, do you know how frightened you were at that time? The bleeding was not stopping, and Dr. Hu was helpless. If it hadn't been for Xiao, my son would not have dared to think about it. Thinking about his mother's situation that day, Lu Zikin still felt frightened. Mrs. Yang raised her hand and touched the injury on her head, is it so serious? Yashan only remembered being pushed by Mrs. Li. Her feet staggered and she fell uncontrollably. Then she lost consciousness. The wound is not serious, but the poison hidden in the body has become active, and the blood in the body cannot coagulate, so the blood will not stop. Mrsya was stunned. Poison? Yanran, you said there is poison in my body. Gu Huayu nodded. Yes, this poison has been hidden in Madam's body for some time. When did you get poisoned? Who poisoned himself? Mrsya asked nervously. How long, what kind of poison? Gu Huayu said, more than 20 years. Sir, my uncle has come over to see my wife. Is she awake? Hello, Madame Ruhi came in to report and saw that Mrsya had woken up. He happily said hello to Mrsya. Luzikin said, my son is going to greet his aunt. Mrsya nodded, go. Luzikin turned around and went out. Because of Mrsgn's visit, Mrsya did not ask further about the poisoning. Mrsgn was so happy when she learned that Mrsya was awake, she immediately sent someone back to her house to report. On the way to Linglong Garden, Mrsgn asked, Zikin, during the days when your mother-in-law has been ill, has the old lady in the mansion come to visit you? Luzikin shook his head and said calmly, no. Mrsgn really doesn't like Mrsyang's character. Due to her self-cultivation, Mrsgn will not comment. He just said, in that case, let's take your mother back today. Luzikin respected Mrsgn from the bottom of his heart and nodded in agreement, okay, Zikin will follow my aunt's arrangement. Mrsgn went to Linglong Garden and immediately asked Aunt Yao to pack the boxes and cages and take Mrsya back to the Chinquo Palace. When Mrsyang learned that Mrsya was awake, she was so angry that she walked around in Rongan Hall, pulled out Mrsya, Luzikin, and Ludinkin and cursed her. In the end, even Dr was not spared. Mrsyang didn't stop scolding her until her servants came in to report that Mrsgn had taken Mrsya back to Chinquo's mansion. The group left the British Duke's mansion. Gu Huayu said goodbye to Mrsgn and Mrsya, and made an appointment to go to the Chinquo Duke's mansion to perform acupuncture on Mrsya tomorrow. Luzikin said, Mom, Aunt, you go back first, I will go and see Xiao off. Gu Huayu wanted to say that there was no need to send it off, but when she saw that Luzikin had already walked over, and Mrsgn and Mrsya looked happy to hear it, she said no more. But she didn't expect that Luzikin would get into her car without avoiding suspicion. Luzikin's actions frightened Gu Huayu and quickly looked at Mrsgn and Mrsya. Seeing Mrsya smiling and waving to her, Gu Huayu blushed with embarrassment. Gu Huayu scolded Luzikin, what are you doing? Mrsya and Mrsgn are still here. Luzikin turned around and saw Gu Huayu blushing like a burning cloud. He raised his hand and rubbed her head, what? Are you shy? Gu Huayu rested her head on Luzikin's shoulder, Qinjian, in broad daylight, shouldn't we avoid suspicion? Luzikin looked up at the roof of the carriage, this carriage has a roof, how can it get light? Gu Huayu pursed her lips and smiled, and said, okay. You are right. King Yu, go back to Wutong Lane. Luzikin raised his right hand and hugged Gu Huayu's shoulder, and then used his left hand to lift Gu Huayu's head, letting Gu Huayu's head rest against him. Xiao, thank you. Gu Huayu raised her head and looked at him, come again? I told you, we don't need to say thank you. Luzikin smiled at Gu Huayu, raised his hand and pressed her head, letting her lean against him. I know, but I still want to say thank you. As you know, since I was a child, my father has been at the border all the time, and he has almost no company for me, and I was born into a family like the British government. Having been in and out of the British government palace for several days in a row, Gu Huayu had some understanding of the British government palace. She could imagine Mrs's difficulty. My mother suffered too much for me in order for me to survive. My mother had to battle wits and courage with Mrsyang all day long. Xiao, When her mother was young, she was famous for being gentle and gentle. Mrs. is gentle and gentle, Gu Huayu asked in surprise. Luzikin lowered his eyes and looked at Gu Huayu and said, "It's hard to imagine, isn't it?" Gu Huayu nodded, "It's really hard to imagine, maybe it's in line with that sentence, a woman is strong as a mother." As soon as Gu Huayu finished speaking, she paused. She didn't know how to express the secret in her heart. Luzikin did not notice anything unusual about Gu Huayu, and nodded in response, "Yes, a woman is strong as a mother. That's what mothers are like. For me, my mother changed from a gentle and considerate little woman with a careless heart, to a shrew who can quarrel with others with her hands on her hips." After hearing Luzikin's words, Gu Huayu suddenly felt relieved. Even though Luzikin was not Mrs's biological child, she treated Luzikin as if she were her own child. Gu Huayu nodded and said, "Mrs is an amazing mother." Luzikin tilted his head and leaned against Gu Huayu's head, "Yes, mother is the most amazing. Xiao, do you know how scared I was when I saw my mother lying on the bed with blood on her head and face?" Gu Huayu raised her hand and touched Luzikin's beautiful face, and said comfortingly, "Don't say it, I know everything." Luzikin rubbed his face against Gu Huayu's hand and said softly, "Xiao, you must be a fairy, the little fairy sent by God to save me." End of this chapter. The Rebirth of Space, the Lucky Girl from a Farm Family. Author, He Would Fire Every. Chapter 280. Chapter 280 Coincidence. I've missed you so much these past few months. By the way, I've been dreaming a lot recently. I dream of you running on a mountain covered with mountain flowers. I'm chasing after you hard. I want to call you, but no matter how hard I try, I can't. Come on, the dream is too real. Every time I wake up, it takes me a long time to come back to my senses. After hearing Luzikin's words, Gu Huayu stopped what she was doing in shock and looked up at Luzikin. Luzikin noticed the change in Gu Huayu's mood, looked down at her, and asked, "Xiao, what's wrong?" Gu Huayu looked at Luzikin blankly, touched his face and said, "What's the name of that mountain?" Luzikin shook his head gently, "I don't know. The mountains are very big, and the flowers all over the mountains and fields are very beautiful. You are running in front of me. I want to hold your hand, but I can't catch up with you. I want to call you to wait for me, but I can't. Every time I speak out, I wake up from my dream." That dream was too real, Luzikin said, as if he had returned to a dream. His voice trembled slightly, and he could not hide his panic. Gu Huayu put her arms around Luzikin's neck, leaned her head on Luzikin's chest, and softly comforted, "It's just a dream." The car suddenly stopped. Gu Huayu sat up straight and looked forward. Just when he was about to ask what happened, Qingyu spoke first, "Princess, we met people from Prince Qi's mansion, and they came towards our car." After leaving Panyuan that day, King Qi tried his best to show his courtesy to Gu Huayu and win her favor. The king of Qi asked people to inquire about Hua Yanran's preferences. Just when he was ready, he received news that Hua Yanran had left Beijing and returned to Xishan. This wait made King Qi feel a little disheartened. Yesterday, he received a tip and learned that Hua Yanran had returned to Beijing. King Qi's sinking heart became lively again. In the past 3 months, with the support of the king and ministers, the wise king has dominated the court. The emperor entrusted important matters such as Qi Wei to the wise king, so that the voice of the wise king in the court became louder and louder. Although the king of Qi has the full support of the Li family, how can the Li family's strength compare with that of the Wang Xiongfu? The king of Qi dreams of Hua Yanran returning to Beijing as soon as possible. As long as Hua Yanran nods and agrees to marry him, he will be absolutely confident that he will step on the wise king. As long as the wise king is stepped down, he can only inherit the throne. After the morning court ended today, King Qi brought Wei Tian and Sun Ning to the Huixian building on Maxing Street. He wanted to set up a game here and ask Li Tao to ask Hua Yan ran out. He and Li Cheng were waiting here to meet Hua Yan ran again by chance. However, King Qi did not expect to meet Hua Yan ran on the street. Gu Huayu felt excited after hearing Qing Yu's words. She was extremely disgusted by King Qi's obvious and undisguised thoughts towards her. Gu Huayu asked hurriedly, "King Yu, where are we?" King Yu replied, "Ma Xing Street, next to it is our Dichang Bank." Gu Huayu quickly thought of countermeasures in her mind. In this era where ethics were the most important thing was not to let Cheetah find out that Lu Ziqin was sitting in the same car with her. Otherwise, it would bring endless trouble to Lu Ziqin. Gu Huayu has always done things neatly. With her thoughts guided, her actions immediately have direction. She said to King Yu, "I'll get off the car here, and you drive the car to the backyard of the bank." King Yu responded, "Okay, I understand." Gu Huayu turned to Lu Ziqin and said, "Qinjian, follow King Yu." Lu Ziqin was worried that King Qi would embarrass Gu Huayu, so he didn't want to leave. "I don't have to leave. Don't worry, he won't do anything to me." How could Gu Huayu not understand what Lu Ziqin meant? It's just that when you can obviously use roundabout tactics to protect yourself, why should you rush forward and die? Gu Huayu said warmly, "Obey, follow King Yu to the bank, and then pick me up. Although I don't care about rumors, there is no need to give people a reason to talk about it, right?" Gu Huayu deliberately brought the topic to herself. Lu Ziqin cared about her, so how could he let her be criticized? After speaking, Gu Huayu squeezed Lu Ziqin's hand and winked at him playfully with her left eye. "I'll deal with it first, remember to come and rescue me." Lu Ziqin nodded in agreement, "Okay. I'll follow your arrangements." Gu Huayu jumped out of the car. Qing Yul turned his horse's head and drove the car into the yard of Dichang Bank. Seeing Gu Huayu get out of the car, Wei Tian turned to the king and said, "Sir, the princess got out of the car and came towards us." King Qi opened the curtain and looked over, and saw Gu Huayu wearing a moon-white plain dress. It was obviously a plain dress, without any fancy, but it gave her an otherworldly feeling. At this time, in the eyes of King Qi, Gu Huayu was as beautiful as if she had stepped out of a painting of a lady, so beautiful that people couldn't take their eyes away. Gu Huayu is tall, graceful when standing and graceful when moving. King Qi's eyes widened when he saw her, and he couldn't help but swallow his saliva. "My maid has met the prince." Gu Huayu stood not far in front of the carriage and paid homage to Prince Qi. King Qi stared at Gu Huayu in a daze, unable to recover for a moment. Wei Tian saw King Qi looking at Gu Huayu in a daze, and reminded him, "Master." King Qi came to his senses, jumped down from the car, bowed his hands to Gu Huayu and said in return, "Hello Yan Ran. Are you here to go shopping?" Gu Huayu bowed to King Qi and said, "My daughter has made an appointment with a friend to come to the bank to do something." King Qi turned to look at Dichang Bank and asked, "Is Yan Ran going to this bank to do business?" Gu Huayu nodded, "Back to your lord, that's right." King Qi said with a smile, "Just in time, I am having a small gathering with Brother Chang, Brother Tao and the rest of the brothers at Huixian Tower today. Can Yan Ran come over after finishing your work?" Gu Huayu looked at Prince Qi with great difficulty, and Fu Shen said, "Thank you for your kindness, Your Majesty. However, I have made an appointment with a friend, so I'm afraid I won't be able to keep the appointment. I wish Your Majesty a happy gathering with the first and second young master Li." King Qi did not expect Gu Huayu to reject him, and felt a little unhappy in his heart. Wei Tianjia interrupted in time, "Your Majesty is sincere, so the princess should not refuse. Anyway, the princess and her friends also want to eat. It just so happens that we can all be together, so it will be more lively." King Qi took the words and said, "That's right, we have to eat anyway, and it's rare for us to meet each other. Yan Ran will take her friends with her after finishing her work. Gu Huayu saw that King Qi would never give up until he achieved his goal, so he knew that it was useless to talk more. I was about to say to see if my friends have time. Lu Ziqin stood at the door of Dichang Bank and shouted to Gu Huayu. Gu Huayu turned around and looked over, smiled and waved to Lu Ziqin, "Brother Ziqin." Lu Ziqin seemed to have just seen King Qi. He walked over slowly, bowed to King Qi and said, "Hello, Your Majesty." When King Qi saw Lu Ziqin, he nodded slightly with a straight face and said with a bit of arrogance, "I heard that Mrs. Ye is ill. Qinjian still has time to go shopping." Gu Huayu didn't want to push Lu Ziqin in any way, so she immediately took over, "Your Majesty, I misunderstood. Brother Ziqin is not here to go shopping. Brother Ziqin is here because I invited him out. I don't understand some accounting matters, I asked Brother Ziqin to help." Gu Huayu kept saying one sentence after another, making King Qi jealous. Asked, "The friend in Yan Ran's mouth is Qinjian?" Gu Huayu nodded and said, "Yes. My daughter has not been in the capital for a long time, and she has very few friends, including Brother Ziqin, Yamei, and Li Er. How long has Brother Ziqin been here?" After Gu Huayu replied to King Qi, he turned to look at Lu Ziqin. Lu Ziqin said, "I have just arrived soon. Since the princess is here, let's go in." After saying that, Lu Ziqin bowed to King Qi and said, "I have something to do, so I'll say goodbye." Gu Huayu followed Fu Shen and said, "My dear, I'll say goodbye. I wish the prince good luck and happiness." Seeing that the two were about to leave, King Qi hurriedly said, "Since we have met, let's just have lunch together. You go to do things first. If the things are done well, come to Huixian Tower for dinner." Lu Ziqin raised his hands and declined politely, "Forget about eating, my mother is not feeling well, and I have to go back to take care of her illness." Hearing Lu Ziqin's refusal, King Qi felt better and said, "Yes, Mrs. Ye is not feeling well. Ziqin has to go to the bedside to attend to her illness, so it is not appropriate to delay outside. Filial piety is important, and I will not keep Qinjian. Yan Ran, Ziqin, it's inconvenient for me to stay for a while, so you can have lunch with me." The aloof look of King Qi made Gu Hua speechless. Gu Huayu said, "Thank you, King Qi, for your kindness. My daughter's grandfather has just passed away, and I am still in the period of filial piety, so it is not appropriate to go to a restaurant. Brother Ziqin, let's go." Lu Ziqin bowed to King Qi to say goodbye, stood up and politely asked Gu Huayu to go forward. King Qi looked at the two people walking into Dichang Bank one after another and clenched his hands. It was the first time in his life that he invited someone to dinner, and was rejected. Wei Tian looked at Lu Ziqin and Gu Huayu, who were walking away in shock. He had been with the prince for many years. Who had seen them and not sticking them up? Has he ever seen the prince invite anyone? These two people actually rejected his prince's invitation. Wei Tian looked back at King Qi and cautiously shouted, "Your Majesty." King Qi withdrew his gaze and walked towards Huixian Tower. As he walked, he ordered, "Let someone tell Brother Cheng that Brother Tao has come to Huixian Tower for lunch." Wei Tian immediately turned around and gave orders, and then quickly followed King Qi. When entering the Huixian Tower, King Qi said, "I want an elegant room facing the street." Wei Tian hurriedly said to the waiter, "I will arrange a private room facing the street for you." The waiter quickly walked to the front, bowed and said, "Your Majesty, please follow me." The waiter took King Qi to the flower hall facing the street. At Dichang Bank, Gu Huayu and Lu Ziqin entered the lobby. Sui Er welcomed them out. After greeting them, he led them to the living room on the second floor. Gu Huayu poured a cup of tea for Lu Ziqin, "Just send Qinjian here. I'll go give Madame acupuncture tomorrow and see you later." Lu Ziqin shook his head, "King Qi's temper will not give up. We didn't go along with his wishes just now, and he must have annoyed us both. At this moment, we must be sitting across from each other and staring here. If I want to leave, he will move behind. I'll find a way to get close to you. No way, she refused so directly. Why would King Chi approach her? Gu Huayu walked to the window, put her fingers on the paper of the window pane, and poked a small hole in the paper. He leaned up and looked through the hole to the other side. The king of Qi in the flower hall stood in front of the window with his hands folded, looking towards Dichang Bank. Gu Huayu turned around and gave Lu Ziqin a thumbs up. Qinjian, you know things like a god, King Qi is looking this way. Lu Ziqin said, he has always been like this. Gu Huayu had no intention of looking at King Qi, so she turned around and pulled Lu Ziqin out. Let's play tunnel battle with him. Tunnel battle? Lu Ziqin asked. Gu Huayu explained, let King Yu and Rugjuan drive away from the front door and go back to their homes. Let's take the car and leave through the back door. Isn't this a confusing war of attacking in the east and attacking in the west? Gu Huayu smiled and said, it's almost the same idea. Going to the backyard, Gu Huayu said to King Yu, drive the car and walk around the street twice before returning to Wutong Lane. Rugjuan will go directly back to Qingqiu Duke's mansion, and Junsheng will take me back to Wutong Lane. King Yu, Rugjuan, and Junsheng bowed down to respond. On the second floor of Huixian building, Wei Tian saw Qing Yu driving his carriage out. He turned to the king and said, the princess's carriage has come out. King Qi held the cup and walked to the window in 2 steps. He looked at the leaving carriage and asked, leaving so soon? Master Lu Liu's car has also come out. Let people follow, King Qi ordered. Wei Tian asked, Your Majesty, are you following both cars? No need, just follow Huayan Ran. Wei Tian got the order, turned around and went out to give instructions. Gu Huayu leaned against Lu Ziqin and asked, Qinjian, if King Qi knows that we are not in the car, will he be very angry? Yes, the relationship between us and him is now complete. Gu Huayu looked up at Lu Ziqin and asked, is King Qi so stingy? Lu Ziqin lowered his head and looked at her, and asked with a smile, you have no joke, how can any monarch joke? Gu Huayu rolled her hair with her hands and said, does he know that he must be a monarch? Lu Ziqin said calmly, among the current princes, he is the eldest. He is the eldest son of the emperor and the son of a noble concubine. It is not surprising that he has such an idea. Lu Ziqin didn't want to talk about King Qi anymore, so he took out an exquisite sandalwood box from his sleeve pocket and said, Xiao, take a look, do you like it? Gu Huayu took the box and asked happily, what is it? A gift for me? You are so good, why do you want to give me a gift? Gu Huayu opened the box as she spoke. She saw a beautifully crafted hasta inside. She reached out and took it in her hand and looked at it carefully. As she looked at it, she said, the pattern is very well done. It's very beautiful. I like it. Give it to me. Lu Ziqin smiled and nodded, as long as you like it. The first day of October is your birthday. I prepared a birthday gift for you. I wanted to give it to you on the first day of October. You were still on the road on the first day of October, so I could only make up for it today. Gu Huayu kissed the hosta, raised her head and said to Lu Ziqin, Qinjian, thank you. Lu Ziqin rubbed Gu Huayu's head and said dotingly, are you still polite to me? Huh. Gu Huayu smiled and hugged Lu Ziqin, okay, then I'm welcome. Lu Ziqin lowered his head and asked, Xiao, you are 15 this year, do you want to hold a hairpin ceremony? Gu Huayu shook her head and said, it should be done. I don't know anything about these things. My grandmother and aunt will take care of the matter of the hairpin ceremony. I will do whatever they say when the time comes. Princess, we're here. Junzhen's words rang out. Okay, I got it. Do you want to come down for a cup of tea? Gu Huayu responded to Junsheng and looked sideways at Lu Ziqin. Why is Junsheng driving the princess's carriage today? Where is King Yu? Shi Niang's voice sounded outside the carriage. End of this chapter.